Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Widow's Lantern. The winds howled outside, fierce and unyielding, battering against the old lighthouse as it stood tall against the raging storm. Inside, the keeper, Jonah, sat in his small, dimly lit quarters, his eyes fixed on the flickering light of his oil lamp. The storm had been relentless for hours, with waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks below, as if the sea itself were trying to tear the earth apart. Jonah had been the keeper of the lighthouse for years, each night spent in solitude, far from the bustling world. He had grown accustomed to the silence, the isolation. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was his only companion, along with the occasional call of seabirds or the distant cry of a ship's bell in the stormy night. But tonight, something felt different. As he sat near the window, staring out into the tempest, Jonah noticed something strange in the distance, something he had never seen before. Amid the storm, a faint light flickered on the shore, just beyond the rocks. It was a soft, almost haunting glow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the storm. His heart quickened. Who would be out there in this weather? He muttered to himself, a feeling of unease creeping over him. But curiosity soon overtook him. There was no reason for anyone to be there, but still the light beckoned. He grabbed his coat, a thick woolen thing that barely kept out the cold, and trudged toward the door. The wind howled as it tore at the lighthouse, but Jonah stepped out into the storm, determined to investigate. The heavy rain stung his face as he made his way down the slippery, rock-covered path that led to the shore. Each step felt like it could be his last, but the light drew him forward, guiding him through the darkness like a moth to a flame. The closer he got to the shore, the more distinct the light became. It was a lantern, glowing softly in the mist, sitting alone on the sand, its flame flickering and swaying with the wind. Jonah's heart raced, his breath quickening as he approached. The lantern was placed carefully on a stone, its glow a strange contrast to the darkness of the night. Who would leave a lantern here? Jonah wondered aloud, though his voice was drowned by the storm. He knelt down beside it, reaching out to touch the cold metal of the lantern. As his fingers brushed the surface, a chill ran up his spine. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind howling louder, as if something unseen was closing in on him. Suddenly, a voice broke through the storm. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. Jonah froze, his hand still on the lantern, his heart pounding in his chest. "Help me!" The voice was soft, almost a plea. Jonah's eyes darted around, searching for the source. There was no one in sight. The shore was empty, save for the lantern, which still flickered eerily in the dark. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had heard of ghost stories, tales of the sea and spirits of the drowned, but he never believed them until now. "Who's there?" Jonah called out, his voice trembling against the fury of the storm. There was no answer, only the deafening crash of waves against the rocks and the incessant howl of the wind. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, closer. "Help me, please." Jonah's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable now, a woman's voice, filled with desperation. It seemed to come from the direction of the lantern, yet there was no one there. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something held him in place, a force beyond his control. "Where are you?" Jonah shouted, his mind racing with fear and confusion. "Who are you?" For a moment there was silence. Then, as if the storm itself had whispered in his ear, he heard it, a name, soft and mournful, carried by the wind. "Eliza!" The name echoed in his mind, and Jonah felt an icy shiver run down his spine. The lantern flickered, its light dimming for a moment before it blazed brightly once more, casting long shadows across the shore. Then from the corner of his eye, Jonah saw it, something moving in the mist, a figure barely visible in the fog. It was a woman, her form shimmering like a ghost, draped in a long, flowing gown that fluttered in the wind. Her hair, dark and wild, whipped around her face as she moved closer, her eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. She was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about her presence, something hollow and sorrowful that made Jonah's heart skip a beat. "Eliza," Jonah whispered, almost not believing his own words. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came from her mouth. Instead, the voice, the same haunting, pleading voice, came again, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around Jonah like the storm itself. "Help me! Help me! I cannot rest." Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The woman's gaze fixed on him, her eyes empty, as though they saw nothing but the depths of the sea itself. "Who are you?" Jonah demanded, his voice shaky but rising above the storm. "What do you want from me?" The woman's form seemed to flicker, like a fading memory, and then she was gone, vanishing into the mist. Jonah stood there, heart hammering in his chest, as the storm roared louder than ever before. The lantern, however, remained, its light burning steadily in the darkness. Jonah backed away, his eyes never leaving the spot where the woman had stood. He didn't know what he had just witnessed, but he could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The storm seemed to have no end, and the woman's voice lingered in his mind, echoing through the crashing waves. He turned and made his way back up the path toward the lighthouse, his thoughts in disarray. The lantern was still visible, its faint glow a reminder of the strange, unearthly encounter he had just experienced. As Jonah reached the top of the cliff, he glanced back one last time. The light on the shore flickered again. Jonah felt a deep, unsettling pull in his chest, like a call he could not ignore. The voice of Eliza echoed in his ears once more, and this time it sounded more desperate, more urgent. Come to me, please." With a sense of dread growing in his gut, Jonah turned away from the lighthouse and began to walk back toward the shore. Something told him he could not leave it alone. Jonah's legs felt heavy as he walked back toward the shore, the wind pressing against his body like an invisible force. The lantern's glow beckoned to him, its soft light flickering through the dense fog, just as the woman's voice echoed in his mind. He couldn't explain it, but something deep within him urged him to return to the shore, to uncover the mystery of the spirit that haunted it. Each step felt like a battle, as though the storm itself was trying to keep him from going further. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks grew louder, the wind howling through the trees, yet Jonah felt an eerie calm descend over him. He had heard the stories of the widow's lantern, whispered among the sailors who came to the lighthouse, but he had always dismissed them as nothing more than superstitions, until now. The mist seemed to thicken as he descended toward the shore, the air growing colder with every step. His breath came out in misty clouds, his teeth chattering despite the heavy coat he wore. But Jonah couldn't stop. The woman's voice called to him, and though his mind screamed for him to turn back, his feet carried him forward. When he reached the shore, the lantern was still there, casting its eerie light across the wet sand. The wind had died down, the storm seeming to pause in anticipation. For a moment, Jonah simply stood there, his eyes locked on the lantern, its flame dancing in the silence. Then, a sound broke the stillness, a faint rustling in the grass behind him. Jonah's heart leapt in his chest, and he spun around, but there was nothing. Only the dark, empty stretch of beach, the waves gently lapping at the shore. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the unease didn't leave him. His eyes drifted back to the lantern, its soft glow growing brighter as though urging him closer. "Who are you?" Jonah called out, his voice shaking in the quiet. "What do you want from me?" But there was no answer, only the endless sound of the sea, the distant cries of gulls, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Jonah stepped forward, his foot sinking slightly into the wet sand. As he reached the lantern, a strange chill ran up his spine, a sense of wrongness settling in the pit of his stomach. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal of the lantern. The flame flickered, casting odd shadows across his face. "Eliza," Jonah whispered, as if speaking her name might answer the questions that haunted him. Suddenly a voice, soft and mournful, broke the silence again, but this time it was louder, clearer. It was not the voice he had heard before, not the pleading whispers carried on the wind, but a voice that came from right behind him. "Jonah," he froze, his blood running cold. His name was spoken in a voice that was both familiar and strange, like a dream he couldn't quite remember. Slowly, Jonah turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing just a few feet behind him, bathed in the faint glow of the lantern, was the woman, Eliza. Her form was more solid now, but still translucent, as though she existed somewhere between the world of the living and the dead. Her long, dark hair flowed around her face like a veil, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her gown, soaked from the storm, clung to her body as though she had emerged from the sea itself. Jonah's pulse quickened. "Eliza," he breathed again, unable to look away. "What do you want from me?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, the voice, that same haunting whisper, rose up once more, wrapping around him like a cold wind. "I need you. Come with me." Jonah took a step back, his heart racing. The atmosphere around him grew heavier, the very air thick with a sense of impending doom. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, of running back to the lighthouse, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the sand. I can't," Jonah stammered, his voice shaking with fear. You're dead. You're a ghost." Eliza's face softened, her expression sorrowful, as though his words pained her. "I was once alive," she whispered, her voice a mere breath against the wind. "I was once like you, but now I am bound to the sea." Her eyes locked onto his, the eerie glow growing brighter. "You see, Jonah, the sea, it takes, it claims, and it keeps. I was lost, and now I am cursed. But I can't be alone. Not anymore." Jonah's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the soft sound of her gown rustling in the air. "I want you to join me," she whispered. "I want you to come with me into the depths. The sea will claim you as it claimed me." Her voice was hypnotic, as though it held a power over him he couldn't resist. Jonah felt his limbs growing weak, his thoughts hazy as though the fog had settled in his mind, clouding his judgment. He took another step back, but his feet felt heavy, like the very ground beneath him was pulling him toward her. "No," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't." Eliza's expression twisted into something darker, more sorrowful. The light from the lantern flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across her face. She reached out, her hand icy cold as it brushed against Jonah's arm, sending a shock of freezing fear through his body. "I have waited so long," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I can't bear this loneliness any longer. You must come with me. I can't be alone in the dark waters. You don't understand. You don't know what it is to drown over and over again." The words twisted in Jonah's mind, each one seeping into his soul like poison. The terror was overwhelming, but he couldn't look away from her. Her eyes, full of sorrow and longing, seemed to pull at something deep inside him. He shook his head, struggling to break free from the hold her gaze had on him. I won't drown with you." But Eliza's voice softened, becoming more tender, more loving. "You don't have a choice, Jonah. You've already heard my call. You've already answered me. Come with me, and you will find peace. You will be free." The wind picked up again, howling louder as the sea churned beneath them, its waves crashing higher and higher, like the ocean itself was preparing to swallow them whole. Jonah's chest tightened, the fear becoming unbearable as he felt himself drawn to her, his legs moving against his will. The woman smiled, her eyes gleaming in the lantern's light. "Join me," she whispered once more. And then, before Jonah could react, her cold hand grasped his wrist tightly, and the world around him seemed to vanish into a cold, dark abyss. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as Eliza's cold hand wrapped around his wrist, her grip tightening like a vice. The sensation of her touch sent a chill through his entire body, like the freezing depths of the ocean had already claimed him. He tried to pull away, but her fingers held him fast, and the more he struggled, the tighter her grip became. "Let me go!" Jonah shouted, his voice ragged with fear. But Eliza's face remained expressionless, her eyes glowing with that eerie, unnatural light, as if nothing in the world could escape her grasp. The wind screamed in the distance, and the waves crashed louder, their roars growing more frantic. Jonah could feel the pull of the sea beneath his feet, like the very earth was shifting, trying to drag him into the water. The lantern beside them flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the sand, and for a moment, Jonah could have sworn he saw shapes moving in the mist, shadows of other lost souls, their faces twisted in silent screams. "I won't go with you," Jonah gasped, his breath shallow. "I won't drown. I won't be like you." Eliza's lips parted, and she leaned in closer, her cold breath brushing against his ear. "You already are," she whispered softly. "You just don't know it yet. The sea claims all, Jonah. All of us. The only question is, will you fight it, or will you let it take you willingly?" The words sank deep into his mind, swirling like a storm in his thoughts. The more she spoke, the more Jonah felt the terror crawl up his spine, making him feel small and powerless. He could see it now, the endless darkness of the ocean, its depths calling to him, pulling at his very soul. He could almost hear the voices of the drowned, faint and distant, their cries lost in the waves. "Stop," Jonah cried out, trying to break free from her grasp. "I don't want to join you. I don't want to die." But Eliza did not release him. Instead, she pulled him closer, her face mere inches from his. Her eyes were hollow, empty like the endless abyss of the sea, yet filled with an overwhelming sadness. "You don't have to die, Jonah," she said softly, her voice like a lullaby. "You just have to come with me. Come with me, and you'll be free of this world. Free of the loneliness. Free of the pain." Jonah's chest tightened as he fought to resist her pull, the terror rising within him like a tidal wave. He tried to take a step back, but his feet sank into the wet sand, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him toward the water. It was as if the very shore itself was alive and hungry. "Let go of me," he yelled, his voice raw with desperation. But Eliza only smiled, a small, sorrowful smile. Her expression softened, her eyes glimmering with a strange, twisted affection. "You can't escape, Jonah. The sea has already claimed you. It's calling you, and it will keep calling until you listen." The air around them seemed to thicken, the mist swirling tighter, pressing in on Jonah from all sides. His vision blurred as the fog grew denser, the sound of the waves louder, almost deafening. His heart pounded in his ears, the relentless crashing of the ocean becoming the only sound he could hear. And then he saw it, something in the water, moving beneath the surface, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, but it grew larger, its shape becoming clearer with every passing second. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. A hand, an enormous, grotesque hand, rising from the water, its fingers long and twisted, its nails like sharp claws. It was followed by another, and then another, until Jonah could see the full shape of the creature. An enormous, monstrous form, its body writhing and shifting beneath the surface like a serpent, its scales glistening in the dim light. Its eyes were glowing like twin orbs of fire, fixated on Jonah as it rose from the depths, its maw opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jonah's mind reeled in horror. He had heard the stories, the tales of sea creatures, of ancient horrors lurking beneath the waves, waiting for the moment to rise. But he never believed them, never thought they were real. And yet, here it was real and hungry. Jonah, Eliza's voice whispered again, now softer, like a lover's breath against his skin. You see it now, don't you? The sea is always hungry. It will never stop. It will never rest. Jonah's body trembled as the creature's massive form rose from the water, its enormous, gaping mouth opening wider, as if preparing to swallow him whole. The very air seemed to crackle with energy, the ocean's fury now focused solely on him. The lantern at his side flickered once more, casting shadows that danced like specters around him. His mind screamed for escape, for freedom, but his body felt paralyzed, trapped in the relentless pull of the sea and the haunting presence of Eliza. The creature's eyes glowed brighter now, its massive form looming over him, blocking out the sky, filling his vision with nothing but the terror of its gaze. No, Jonah whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible against the roar of the waves. Please, please help me. But Eliza only shook her head, her lips curling into a bitter, sorrowful smile. There is no escape, Jonah. There is no help. The sea will claim you just as it claimed me. The only question is, will you join me willingly, or will you fight until it drags you down? Jonah's heart raced, his breath shallow, the terror growing inside him like an uncontrollable force. His gaze turned toward the horizon, but all he could see was the monstrous shape rising from the water, the darkness of the sea swallowing the sky. His mind, clouded with fear, began to frantically search for a way out. And then it happened. With a sudden, violent surge, the creature lunged forward, its enormous mouth snapping shut with a deafening crack. Jonah felt the ground beneath him shake as the creature's massive body hit the shore, its claws tearing into the sand. The air around him grew even colder, the mist thickening into an impenetrable wall of white. Jonah gasped, the cold grip of fear clutching at his chest. He stumbled backward, desperate to flee, but the sand beneath his feet gave way, and he felt himself falling, tumbling toward the edge of the shore, toward the darkness of the sea itself. Jonah's heart raced as he tumbled toward the water, his feet slipping on the slick sand, his arms flailing in a desperate attempt to grab hold of something, anything. The deafening roar of the waves crashed in his ears, as though the very ocean itself was about to consume him. The mist swirled, thick and choking, reducing everything around him to shadows and darkness. His fingers brushed the edge of a rock, but it was too late. With a final lurch, the ground beneath him gave way entirely. He was pulled toward the sea, his body weightless in the icy grip of the water, the cold sinking deep into his bones as the waves rushed over him. His breath caught in his throat, the salt water seeping into his mouth as he struggled to stay afloat. Panic surged through him, his chest tightening with each desperate breath he took. But the water seemed endless, like a vast, cold abyss pulling him down into its depths. Jonah! The voice was soft, distant, and yet unmistakable. Eliza's voice. Her words rang in his ears, as though she were right there with him, whispering from just beneath the surface of the water. He twisted his head, trying to spot her, but the mist was so thick that he could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. Jonah, she whispered again, this time closer, like a lover's breath, echoing in the darkened space. It's so easy to let go. You don't have to fight anymore. Come with me. Jonah's body trembled with fear and exhaustion, his strength waning with each passing moment. The water was cold, so cold it burned, and the pull of the sea was relentless, dragging him further away from the shore with each wave. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but the surface of the water seemed to recede with each desperate breath, the sea swallowing him whole. He could feel it. Something was waiting beneath the waves, something ancient and dark, a presence that had been there long before Eliza ever spoke to him. No, he screamed, though the sound was lost to the roaring sea. I won't go. But the water seemed to laugh at him, mocking him as it rose higher and higher, the pressure of the ocean around him building like the weight of the world. Jonah's head was spinning, his limbs growing heavier, as if the very water was seeping into his veins, dragging him under. Join me, Jonah, Eliza's voice coaxed again, sweet and soft, but this time there was something else in it. Something darker, something twisted. You belong here. This is where you've always been meant to be. His eyes flickered open, and through the thick, swirling mist, he saw her again, Eliza, her form faint but unmistakable, standing just at the edge of the water. She was no longer translucent, no longer the ghostly figure that haunted his dreams. Now she was solid, her face pale and drawn, her eyes glowing with an unsettling fire. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice almost pleading now, her outstretched hand reaching toward him. "Come with me. Together we can be free. Together we can escape this world." Jonah's body ached with the cold, and every muscle screamed for him to give in, to let go. The water around him seemed to pulse, alive with a strange, unnatural force, as though the ocean itself had become a part of her, part of the curse that bound them both. "I won't," Jonah gasped, though it felt like the words barely left his throat. His head was spinning, his vision blurry, and the water pressed down on him like a heavy weight. "I won't drown," but the sea was deaf to his cries. With a final violent surge, the water seemed to rise up around him, swallowing him whole, dragging him down into the depths. Jonah screamed, his body convulsing as the coldness seeped deeper into his skin, into his very soul. The last thing he saw before the darkness enveloped him completely was Eliza's face, her expression soft, almost kind, as she held out her hand to him. Then, everything went black. Jonah awoke with a gasp, his lungs burning for air. He shot up from the cold, wet sand, his body trembling as though he had been drowning for hours. He was back on the shore alone. The wind howled around him, and the mist still clung to the beach, but the terrifying figure of Eliza was gone. His heart pounded in his chest, the memory of her face lingering in his mind, a haunting reminder of what had almost happened. Jonah took deep, shaky breaths, trying to steady himself, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wet sand. What was real? What had just happened? The lines between the living and the dead, between the world he knew and the world beyond, had blurred so completely that he wasn't sure anymore. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was deafening now, and the air smelled of salt and rot. Jonah tried to stand, but his legs were weak, like jelly, and the weight of what had just transpired hung heavily on his chest. The water lapped at his feet, its cool touch a stark reminder of how close he had come to being claimed by the sea. "Jonah!" That voice again. Eliza's voice. Jonah froze, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. He turned slowly, his body trembling as he searched the fog for her presence. But there was nothing. The beach was empty. No lantern. No figure. No trace of the spirit who had almost dragged him into the sea. "Jonah!" The voice called again, and this time it was louder, closer. "You can't run from me forever." His blood ran cold as he took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. No matter how far he went, no matter how much he tried to escape, the sea would always be there, calling to him, pulling him under. And Eliza would always be there, waiting. Jonah turned, his legs nearly buckling beneath him as he stumbled back toward the lighthouse, every instinct screaming at him to get inside, to get away from the shore before it was too late. But the voice followed him, faint but persistent, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You belong to me now, Jonah." And as Jonah reached the door of the lighthouse, the lantern flickered in the distance, its eerie glow shining through the mist once more. It was still waiting for him, and the sea, it was still calling. The fog rolled in thicker, and Jonah knew there would be no escaping it. Not this time. The sea had claimed him, and now it would never let him go. Jonah's hand trembled as it gripped the cold metal of the lighthouse door. He could feel the weight of the sea pressing down on him, suffocating him, as if the ocean itself were closing in around him, pulling him into its depths. He wanted to run, to escape, but every step he took felt like he was walking deeper into the very heart of the nightmare. With a frantic shove, Jonah pushed the door open and stumbled inside, his body shaking from head to toe. The familiar, musty scent of the lighthouse filled his lungs, but it offered little comfort. The walls, once sturdy and reliable, now felt like they were closing in on him, their old wood groaning in protest. He didn't dare look back. He could feel her presence, like a shadow creeping just behind him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He rushed up the winding staircase, his breath ragged, each step a painful reminder of the terror he'd just escaped. The storm outside was raging harder now, the wind howling like the anguished wails of the lost souls beneath the waves. The light of the lantern at the top of the lighthouse flickered as if it, too, were fighting against the pull of the sea. Jonah's pulse raced as he reached the top, his fingers slick with sweat as he reached for the crank that powered the light. But before he could even touch it, a cold voice filled the room. Jonah. His heart stopped. He knew that voice. He knew it too well. Turning slowly, Jonah found himself face to face with her, Eliza. She stood just inside the doorway, her pale figure almost blending into the fog that had followed her. Her eyes, now darker than before, glowed with an unnatural light. The expression on her face was no longer sorrowful, but twisted, almost cruel. "You can't escape me, Jonah," she said, her voice low, filled with a terrifying finality. "The sea has claimed you. There is no running from it. There's no hiding from it." Jonah's breath hitched as he backed away from her, his body slamming into the cold metal rail of the lighthouse's catwalk. The lantern's glow seemed to dim, its light flickering weakly as if it were about to go out. "Please," Jonah begged, his voice cracking. He could hear the faintest echoes of the storm outside, but they sounded far away now, muted. His world had shrunk to this narrow room, the oppressive presence of Eliza pushing in on him from all sides. "Please, I don't want to be like you. I don't want to die." Eliza tilted her head, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Die," she repeated, her voice soft and dangerous. "Jonah, you're already dead. You've been dead the moment you stepped onto this cursed shore. The sea claimed me. It's claimed you now, too." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath away. Jonah felt the ground beneath him begin to tremble, as if the lighthouse was shaking with the very force of the ocean below, its power rising to claim him. "No!" Jonah screamed, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of Eliza's cold, relentless gaze. His chest tightened, his heart racing, and his vision blurred. He could feel the weight of the sea, its depths, its darkness, pressing against him, trying to drag him down, to pull him into its cold embrace. "Eliza, please," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Help me. I don't want to drown. I don't want to be like you." For a moment, Eliza's expression softened, a flicker of something human, something familiar, in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the emptiness of the sea. "You think you have a choice?" she asked, her voice almost pitying. "The sea doesn't care what you want. It's calling you, and it always gets what it wants." Jonah felt the cold air around him grow colder still, and the wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the lighthouse. The light of the lantern flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. For a moment, Jonah saw something, no, someone, moving in the shadows. A figure, pale and ghostly, crawling toward him. Its face was obscured by dark, matted hair, but Jonah could feel its eyes upon him, empty and hungry. "Help me," Jonah cried, but the words were lost in the wind. The figure moved closer, its body twitching unnaturally, its hands reaching for him. Jonah stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him, but the shadow reached out, its fingers brushing against his ankle. A shock of cold seared through him, spreading through his veins like ice. With a guttural scream, Jonah kicked out, managing to break free from its grip. He scrambled backward, heart pounding in his chest, his body trembling with terror. The figure dissolved into the fog, but the cold sensation lingered, an icy grip that held him in place. "Eliza!" Jonah shouted, his voice desperate, pleading. "Please make it stop." But Eliza didn't respond. She stood there, her eyes locked onto his, watching him with a detached, almost amused expression. "You can't fight the sea, Jonah," she said, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't run from it. It will drag you under, whether you fight or not. Just like it did to me." Jonah's breath caught in his throat as the darkness around him seemed to thicken. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched, growing longer, reaching out toward him like twisted fingers. He could hear something beneath the waves, faint and haunting, calling his name, a distant cry that tugged at his soul. He turned to the lantern again, his eyes wild, desperate for a way out. But it was too late. The light flickered one final time, and then all at once it went out. Darkness consumed the room, and Jonah was left alone with the cold, empty sound of the ocean. A laugh, a low, hollow sound, echoed in the dark. Eliza's laugh, and Jonah knew in that moment that he was truly lost. The sea had claimed him, just as it had claimed her, and now there would be no escape. The darkness swallowed him whole. Jonah's breath became shallow, his heart pounding in his chest as the silence of the lighthouse seemed to press in around him. The cold that had once been just a chill now gripped him, seeping into his bones. His limbs felt numb, heavy, as though the weight of the ocean had already dragged him into its depths. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. His eyes strained against the darkness, but there was no sign of her. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, shifting like living things, crawling across the floor toward him. He could feel the oppressive weight of the sea bearing down on him, its pull tightening around his chest. Then a sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable, the faintest whisper of water. He turned, his pulse quickening. The lantern was out, but the mist outside had crept through the cracks in the windows, and the faint light of the moon barely cut through the fog. Jonah's mind spun, trying to make sense of the scene. The lighthouse creaked, its old bones groaning as the storm outside raged. "Eliza?" Jonah called again, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me? What did you mean? I don't want to die. I don't want to become like you." The sea. It was always the sea. There was a pause, an unnatural stillness, and then a low, soft murmur that chilled him to his very core. It came from all around him, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "You're already becoming like me, Jonah." The voice came again, colder this time, hollow and distant. "You were always meant to join us, to follow the call of the sea. You just couldn't hear it before." Jonah's stomach churned as the voice seemed to swirl around him, wrapping around him like a net. The water, the sea, the call that Eliza had spoken of. He could hear it now, faint but unmistakable, like the lapping of waves against rocks, the murmur of the deep calling his name. It was both beautiful and terrifying. His body trembled as he took a step back, his eyes darting to the window, but all he could see was the mist. The water had come so close now, he could feel it, could almost taste the salt in the air. He could hear the creatures beneath the surface, calling to him, beckoning him with their dark, ancient voices. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if the sea itself were creeping closer. "No," Jonah whispered, shaking his head. I won't listen to it." But his voice trembled with uncertainty. His hands, slick with sweat, grasped at the railing around the lighthouse's catwalk, and for a moment it seemed to give way beneath his touch. The floor was shifting, the sea's hunger pulling at his feet, at his legs, as though the very earth beneath him was being swallowed by the waves. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Jonah, come with us." His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming weight of the call. The walls seemed to close in around him, the very air growing thick with the damp scent of the sea. Jonah turned quickly, his heart racing, and nearly stumbled into the lantern. He glanced at it, and then his eyes locked on the strange, flickering reflection in the glass. For a moment, he thought he saw Eliza. No, not just her, but others, faces that he recognized, faces of sailors long lost to the sea. Their eyes were wide with terror, their faces gaunt, like the sea had claimed their souls. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped. Jonah recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his throat dry as though he had already swallowed the salt water. "No," he whispered again. "I'm not like them. I'm not like you." But the reflection in the lantern's glass didn't change. It only grew clearer, more insistent, as if the spirits within it were beckoning him to step closer. Their eyes locked onto his, their silent pleas becoming his own. "Please," Jonah begged, his voice barely audible. "Please, no. I can't." His body was trembling uncontrollably now, the terror inside him spiraling out of control. He could feel the sea calling, urging him toward it, a pressure building in his chest as if the very water was forcing its way into his lungs. He could hear it now, clearer than ever, the distant crashing of waves, the roar of the ocean, the pull of something ancient and dark that had been waiting for him. "Eliza!" Jonah shouted, desperate, his voice cracking with fear. "What do you want from me? Why won't you let me go?" The shadows around him began to shift, swirling faster and faster, coiling like a serpent about to strike. The air was thick with the sound of the waves, now louder, more deafening. Jonah staggered back, his hands reaching out blindly, trying to grasp at something solid, but there was nothing. "Eliza!" he cried out again, his voice hoarse. "Please, I'm not ready to die." But the only answer was the sound of the sea, the distant whispers, the murmurs of the deep, calling him, drawing him in. It was impossible to fight it, impossible to resist. Then, suddenly, everything fell silent. The mist outside had thickened to the point that it was nearly impossible to see anything. The world around him was a blur of dark shapes, shadows twisting and shifting. But one thing was clear, the faintest flicker of light, distant and dim, glowing just beyond the horizon. Jonah froze. The lantern's light, the light that had once been his only guide, flickered once more. And then, out of the mist, he saw her. Eliza, standing on the edge of the catwalk, her silhouette barely visible in the fog. Her eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto his, and for a moment he saw something in them, something that wasn't there before. "Jonah," she said softly, her voice no longer cold or cruel, but almost tender, like a whisper from the past. "You've been running for so long. You've been hiding from what you are. But you belong here with us. We can end your suffering." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like the call of the ocean itself. Jonah's head spun, his chest tight with fear and confusion. He couldn't escape. He knew it now. The sea would claim him, just as it had claimed Eliza, just as it had claimed all those who had gone before him. But in the darkness, amidst the call of the deep, Jonah realized the truth. He wasn't running anymore. Jonah stepped forward, his body moving without thought, drawn by the call of the sea, by the pull of Eliza's gaze. He could feel the ocean calling, the shadows shifting, and for the first time, he knew what it meant to belong. The sea had claimed him, and now he would join the others, a part of the darkness beneath the waves. Jonah's footsteps were soft on the wooden catwalk as he moved closer to Eliza, his body moving with a force that felt foreign, as though his limbs were not his own. The air around him was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, the ocean's roar growing louder with every step. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind felt numb, distant, like it was no longer in control of his actions. Eliza's eyes never left him, her pale figure now almost indistinguishable from the mist, save for the faint, eerie glow that emanated from her. Her expression was soft, almost sad, but there was a glint in her eyes, a glint that chilled him to his very soul. "You've come, Jonah," she said, her voice a mere whisper, barely audible over the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. "You've finally heard the call." Jonah's breath hitched. The sea, the pull of the ocean, it was overwhelming now, a tide that swept away any thought, any resistance. He felt himself getting closer to her, his feet moving on their own, his mind lost in the fog of her gaze. "I don't want to be like you," Jonah whispered, but the words felt hollow, weak. They were drowned out by the pounding of his heart, the waves that crashed inside his skull, and the cold embrace of the water that beckoned from below. "You already are," Eliza replied, her voice soft, but it sent a tremor down his spine. She stepped closer to him, her fingers brushing the edge of the catwalk. "This place, the sea, it never lets go, Jonah. It only claims what's meant to be taken. And now you're part of it. Forever." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jonah opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The reality of her words was sinking in, the truth that had been hiding beneath the surface of his thoughts, now rising like a dark tide. He was already lost, swallowed by the curse of the lighthouse, by the call of the sea. His life, his past, all of it felt so distant, like a fading dream that was slipping away from him. The water below him seemed to call to him louder now, as if it were alive, reaching up toward him with dark, unseen hands. He felt a chill sweep through him, a feeling that no warmth, no light, could chase away. "Come closer," Eliza whispered, her voice now barely a breath against his ear. "Let the sea take you. It's your destiny." Jonah's vision blurred as he looked at the horizon. The fog was thick, swirling in impossible patterns, and the sea below churned with violent force. But there was something in the distance, something in the mist. The faint flicker of lantern light, as though it were the soul of the ocean itself, burning brightly against the dark backdrop of the storm. He knew that light. It was calling him, just like the voices, just like the whispers that had tormented him from the very first night. "Eliza," Jonah murmured, his voice thick with the weight of his fear and confusion. "What happened to you? Why are you like this? Why did you come for me?" She stepped closer, her form now less a person than a shadow, her eyes glowing with an ancient, hollow fire. "I was once like you, Jonah, lost, looking for something I couldn't understand. The sea chose me, as it has chosen you. There is no escape. There is only the calling, and in the end, we all answer." Her words echoed in his mind, and Jonah felt something shift within him. A deep, unshakable pull, an undeniable desire to step forward to join her. The darkness of the ocean was no longer an enemy, it was a part of him. He could feel it now, the weight of it pressing against his chest, pulling him toward it like a magnet. "I can't," he gasped, his voice trembling. "I don't want to drown. I don't want to—" The words died in his throat as he felt a surge of coldness wash over him, as if the sea itself had reached up to claim him. He stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him, and for a moment he felt as though he might fall. But Eliza was there, her hand on his arm, steadying him. "You will never drown, Jonah," she said softly, her voice soothing like a lullaby. "You will be one with the ocean. You will become the waves, the tide. You will never be alone again." Jonah's head spun, the ocean's call overwhelming him, drowning out all other thoughts. The sea had claimed him, just as it had claimed Eliza. He could feel it now, a part of him, sinking deeper into his very soul, wrapping him in its cold, endless embrace. A flash of movement caught his eye. Far below, on the shore, a shadowy figure stood, barely visible through the mist. The figure was beckoning him, its arms stretched wide, as if calling him to join it. Jonah's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. It was the same shadow he had seen in the lantern's reflection. A sailor, lost long ago to the sea, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with the endless hunger of the ocean. He was calling Jonah, his voice a whisper on the wind. Jonah stepped toward the edge of the catwalk, his body moving almost without thought. The wind howled around him, tugging at his clothes, pulling him closer to the precipice. "Eliza, what if I don't want to?" he whispered, his voice barely audible against the storm. But Eliza's voice was the only sound he heard now. "There is no choice, Jonah. The sea is already inside you. You can feel it. Let go. It's the only way to find peace." The words echoed in his mind, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him closer to the edge. The mist swirled around him, thick and oppressive, and the water below beckoned him, dark and eternal. Jonah's eyes locked on the figure on the shore. It was closer now, its face more distinct, no longer the ghostly figure he had seen in the lantern, but a man, a sailor, eyes wide with the same hunger he felt stirring deep within him. His heart hammered in his chest. The pull of the sea was too strong, the desire to be free from his torment too great. He could no longer remember why he had fought, why he had resisted. Everything that had once mattered, his life, his past, his fears, had dissolved into the fog. Jonah took a step forward, his foot leaving the solid ground of the lighthouse catwalk. The wind roared around him, the waves crashing against the rocks below as though they were celebrating, waiting for him to join them. And in that moment Jonah knew. The sea had claimed him. The waves rose up to meet him, and he fell into the darkness. Jonah's body plunged into the cold, unforgiving water. The force of the waves crushed against him, pushing him deep into the depths, the roar of the ocean swallowing every sound, every thought. For a brief moment, he felt the sting of the salt water filling his lungs, his body twisting and turning in the violent current. His hands flailed, grasping for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. Only the dark, endless water. His vision blurred, and all he could see were shadows dancing beneath him, flickering like the ghosts of sailors long dead, their bodies dragged into the deep, their souls forever lost to the ocean's hunger. The cold clung to him, suffocating him, and he fought to keep his senses, to find some spark of life within the overwhelming embrace of the sea. But it was useless. The ocean was too strong, too powerful. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed Eliza and the others before her. Jonah's body was no longer his own. It moved with the current, pulled further and further into the abyss. The sea had become his master, and he was nothing but a puppet in its grasp. He could feel the pressure building, the deep, unrelenting pressure of the ocean's depths. It pressed in on him from all sides, crushing him, suffocating him. His mind screamed for air, but there was none. His chest ached as the cold swallowed him whole, and the water seemed to pulse around him, alive with the presence of something ancient and powerful, something far older than the storms that raged above. And then, as if by some twisted mercy, everything went black. When Jonah opened his eyes, he was no longer in the cold, crushing embrace of the ocean. He was standing, or at least it felt like he was standing. The air around him was thick with fog, the world muted and distorted, as though he were seeing it through a veil. The scent of salt and decay hung in the air, but there was something else, something that made his stomach churn. A low, mournful wail echoed through the mist, distant but unmistakable. It was the sound of the ocean calling, the same sound that had lured him, that had beckoned him toward the shore. His heart pounded in his chest, and he took a shaky step forward, his legs unsteady, as though they weren't quite his own. The fog parted before him, revealing a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath his feet was wet, slick with seawater, and the air felt thick with the presence of something ancient. Jonah could feel it, a pressure in the air that weighed on him, something that existed just beyond his reach, something dark and insistent. And then, through the mist, he saw her again. Eliza. She stood at the edge of a vast, swirling abyss, her pale figure bathed in the faint glow of the lantern. Her eyes were wide, glowing with that same eerie light, her face as distant and cold as the sea itself. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, Jonah saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't just lost to the sea. She was the sea. She was its spirit, its hunger, its endless call. Eliza, Jonah's voice cracked as he stepped toward her, but his legs felt heavy, as though the ground beneath him was pulling him down, dragging him into the abyss with each step. Eliza, what is this place? Where am I? She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she gazed at him, her eyes dark with the weight of ages, and for a moment, Jonah thought he saw something flicker in her expression. Pity? Regret? Perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced once again by the cold, eternal gaze of the ocean. This is the sea's realm, she said softly, her voice no longer gentle, but firm, as though it was the very voice of the ocean itself. "This is where the lost souls go, where we all belong now. You, me, the others. We were all called by the waves. And now, Jonah, you are one of us." Jonah's chest tightened at her words, and his heart raced. No, I don't want this. I can't be like you. I'm not a part of this." But as he spoke, he could feel it, a pull deep in his chest, a tugging sensation that made him feel lighter, as though his very soul was being drawn toward the sea. His body felt weightless, and his legs buckled beneath him. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. "Eliza, please," he begged, his voice hoarse. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The fog swirled around them, thickening with every word. The ocean's call grew louder, a constant hum that filled the air, reverberating through his bones. The sea had always been there, always calling, but now it was here all around him, and there was no escaping it. "You've already answered," Eliza whispered, her voice softer now, almost a sigh. "The sea doesn't need words. It only needs you to listen. And now you are one with it, one of the lost, one of the waves." Jonah's eyes widened as the fog around him thickened, coiling like serpents, wrapping around him, pulling him closer to the edge of the abyss. The sea below churned with dark, tumultuous waves, a mass of swirling shadows that seemed to be alive. They reached up toward him, like the outstretched hands of the dead, grasping at him, dragging him toward the water. No, please," Jonah screamed, but his voice was lost in the roar of the ocean. His body felt weightless, floating, as if the sea was already claiming him. Eliza stepped closer, her face now inches from his, her glowing eyes staring into his soul. "There is no escape, Jonah. You belong to the sea now. You are no longer a man. You are a part of the waves, a part of the ocean, and you will call to others, just as I did, just as they all did." Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he looked into her eyes. He saw the endless abyss, the dark, hungry depths of the ocean reflected in her gaze. He saw the lost souls, the sailors, the forgotten ones, facing the same fate, the same curse. The sea never let go. It never forgave. He was one of them now, one of the lost. The ocean's grip tightened. Jonah's mind was slipping away, his consciousness sinking into the dark, cold waters of the abyss. The last thing he felt was the pull of the sea, dragging him deeper, deeper into its endless hunger. And then there was nothing, only the deep, eternal darkness of the ocean. The lighthouse stood, silent, overlooking the stormy sea. The lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rocks below. And on the shore, a figure stood in the mist, waiting for the next soul to answer the call. Name of the next story: The House That Moves. The Thompson family had always dreamed of living in a place where they could start fresh, away from the noise of the city. When they found the house, it seemed perfect. It was a charming old place on the outskirts of town, with wide windows and a deep green yard. The price was surprisingly low, and after a quick tour, they signed the papers without hesitation. They were eager to leave behind the chaos of city life for a simpler, quieter existence. When they first moved in, everything felt wonderful. The house creaked in all the right places, the wooden floors felt warm underfoot, and the fireplace gave off a comforting glow. The rooms were spacious, filled with sunlight, and there was a sense of peace that settled over them. It was like they had finally found a home, a place where they could all breathe a little easier. The first night, however, was unsettling in a way that none of them could explain. As the moon rose high in the sky, Sarah Thompson, the mother, stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the yard. The wind was picking up, rustling the trees in the distance. The house seemed to shift with the gusts, a soft groan from the wooden walls, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Or so she thought. She shook her head and went to bed, chalking it up to exhaustion. The next morning, she was up before anyone else, making coffee in the kitchen. She glanced out the window and froze. The entire house, had moved. It wasn't in the same spot anymore. The front yard was facing a completely different direction, and the driveway that had been there last night was now on the other side of the house. Sarah blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. The house was definitely not in the same place. The garden, the fence, even the road seemed different, though she couldn't tell exactly how. She stepped outside, and the morning sun hit her face, making everything seem oddly bright, almost too bright. She looked toward the barn at the edge of the property. Last night, it had been to the left of the house, but now it was far behind it. A shiver ran down her spine as she turned around to look at the front of the house. Her husband, Tom, was already standing at the doorway, staring out at the yard in disbelief. "Tom," Sarah said quietly. "The house, it moved." Tom frowned and walked toward her, his eyes scanning the yard, his face pale. "That's not possible," he murmured, but even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, sickening sensation. "Maybe we're just tired, Sarah," he said. "It could just be the angle of the light, or the way the house was built. Let's not overthink it." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house had moved. There was no denying it. She couldn't explain how or why, but the nagging feeling in her chest told her to keep her eyes open, to stay alert. That night, as they all sat down for dinner, a sense of unease settled over them. The house was still. The wind had died down and everything was quiet, but the atmosphere felt thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. Tom tried to make light of it. "Maybe we're just adjusting to the place. It's old, you know. Could be all the creaks and groans are just part of it settling in. It's probably just some odd quirk of the house." The kids, Emily and Ethan, were too young to fully grasp the tension in the air, but they too felt it. They kept glancing around, their voices quiet, their eyes wide as if they sensed something in the shadows. Every time the house creaked, they flinched. After dinner, Emily wandered outside, her small figure vanishing into the fading light. "Emily, get back inside," Sarah called, her voice tight with worry. But Emily didn't respond. Tom quickly stood up and walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "Emily," he shouted. The door slammed open, and Emily was standing there, looking out at the yard with a distant expression, her eyes wide. She turned to her parents, her face ashen. "It moved again," she whispered. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look. They didn't have to ask her what she meant. The next morning, things were even worse. The house had shifted again, this time more dramatically. The front door was now facing an entirely different direction, and the driveway had shifted entirely. The barn that had been to the back left of the property was now right in front of them, as though the house had dragged it along. "No," Sarah whispered. "This can't be happening." She looked around, but the land, the roads, everything, nothing made sense anymore. The house was shifting places, not by just a few feet, but miles at a time. There was no explanation for it. They were completely isolated from the rest of the world. "We need to leave," Tom said, his voice harsh. "This is too much. We can't stay here." But as soon as they tried to leave, they realized something terrifying. The road that led them out of the area, the road that had been there the night before, was gone. They were trapped. With nowhere else to go, they decided to spend the night, hoping the morning would bring some clarity. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something darker began to take hold. The house began to shift again, as though it were alive, and this time it felt different. There was a low, guttural rumble, like the sound of earth moving, followed by a deep creaking noise, the kind that made the air seem to bend around them. The walls of the house groaned and twisted as though they were stretching. Tom rushed to the windows, his face turning pale as he looked out into the yard. "Something's out there," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to get away." But it was too late. They were no longer alone. From the shadows of the yard, figures began to emerge. They were tall, thin, and their faces were obscured by darkness. The movement was fluid and unnatural, as if the figures were made of smoke or mist. They moved toward the house, walking slowly, deliberately. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice small. She had seen them first, just like she had sensed the house moving before. She was no longer afraid. Instead, she was drawn to them. Tom looked to Sarah, his face etched with fear. "What are they?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered back, but she could feel it. Their presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She knew they weren't human. They were something else, and the house had brought them here. The door of the house opened, creaking as though it had a life of its own, swinging wide. The figures stopped at the edge of the yard, their hollow, empty eyes fixed on the open door. The house was waiting, calling them. "We have to leave," Tom said again, his voice breaking. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the door, but just as they reached it, the house groaned louder, the walls bending inward. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder. "We can't leave," Sarah whispered. "We're part of it now." And with that, she turned back toward the house, her body moving with a force she couldn't explain, as though something was pulling her inside. The house had moved again, but this time it was different. It was no longer just a place. It was a being, and it was searching for them, for her family. They were part of it now, trapped in its endless hunger, and it would not rest until it found what it was searching for. The house was alive. The realization hit Sarah like a wave, suffocating and overwhelming. It wasn't just an old building with creaky floors and shifting walls. It had a will, a purpose, and it had drawn them into its web, inch by slow inch. The air inside felt thick, like it was closing in around them, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. Tom stood frozen by the door, eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't just stay here, Sarah. We need to get out now." His voice was trembling, but there was an urgency to it, as though the house itself might swallow them whole if they didn't leave. But Sarah couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. The house was pulling her in. Every creak, every shift of the floorboards seemed to hum with an eerie, low sound, like the house itself was breathing, alive with an unspoken hunger. Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet shift ever so slightly, and she looked around in confusion. The walls were no longer static. They were subtly changing shape, the angles warping as if the house were twisting, distorting the very space around her. "Sarah, please." Tom's voice broke through her daze. He reached for her, pulling her away from the threshold of the door. She stumbled backward into his arms, snapping back to reality. "What's happening?" Sarah asked in a breathless whisper, her mind racing to process everything she had seen and felt. "Why is it doing this?" Tom's face was pale, his eyes frantic. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we can't fight it. We have to get out of here. We have to." The words died in his throat as a loud, shuddering sound filled the room, the walls groaning under an immense pressure. The house seemed to throb, a heavy, thudding pulse emanating from deep within its bones. Sarah looked up in horror. The house wasn't just moving, it was searching for something, or someone. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice quivering. Tom nodded slowly, his face grim. It's alive, like it's reaching out for something." As if on cue, a low, creaking sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was a sound that wasn't like anything they had heard before. Not the typical groaning of old wood settling, but something far darker. Something sinister. "I think it's looking for us," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible. And just like that, the house responded. A sudden jolt of movement caused them both to stumble. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and the walls swayed ever so slightly, as though the house itself had tilted on its foundation. The door slammed shut with a loud, resounding bang, trapping them inside. Tom rushed to the window and yanked the curtains aside. But the view outside wasn't what he expected. The yard was different again. The trees, the shrubs, the distant fence, they were all in new places, as though the house had rearranged the entire property overnight. The driveway, the path to the front gate, gone. The house had moved again. I told you it was searching for something, Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fear. It's not done. It won't stop until it finds what it's looking for. Tom gripped the window frame so hard his knuckles turned white. What does it want from us, Sarah? Why us? Sarah didn't have an answer. The fear that had taken root in her chest was now a cold, heavy weight, spreading throughout her limbs, making it hard to breathe. It was all too much, too fast. The house that shifted, the eerie figures that had appeared the night before. It was as if they were living inside a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The kids, Emily and Ethan, were huddled together in the corner, their faces pale, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Emily, who had always been so curious, was silent, her eyes glued to the door, as if waiting for something to happen. Ethan clutched his sister's hand tightly, his little face crumpled in distress. What's happening, Mom? Emily's voice trembled as she spoke, the question so simple, yet so impossible to answer. Why does the house keep moving? Where are we? Sarah crouched down to her daughter's level, trying to offer comfort that she didn't feel. I don't know, sweetie, but we're going to stay together. We're going to be okay. I promise. But deep inside, Sarah wasn't so sure. The house was alive, and it was searching. For them. For something else. And it wasn't going to stop. Mom, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. I saw it. Sarah looked at her son, her heart pounding in her chest. Saw what, honey? The shadow, Ethan whispered again. His eyes flicked nervously to the hallway. I saw it move last night. I saw something standing in the doorway. A cold chill washed over Sarah, and she turned to Tom, who was already looking at her with wide, alarmed eyes. The shadow, the figures from the night before, the ones that had emerged from the yard. Had they come inside? Were they part of this? Before she could say anything, the house groaned again, louder this time. The walls quivered with an unnatural force. The sound of scraping would fill the air, followed by a deafening silence. It was as though the house was holding its breath. Then a strange, deep rumbling sound came from the floor beneath their feet, like the shifting of heavy furniture, or something much worse. Get away from the walls, Tom shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back as the floor beneath them trembled. The ground cracked open in front of them, a deep, jagged fissure splitting the floor. From the crack emerged thick, dark tendrils of shadow, twisting and reaching out like the fingers of something monstrous, something ancient creeping toward them. Sarah gasped and pulled the kids closer, her heart racing. We need to get out. Now. But there was no way out. The door had sealed shut, and the windows were covered in the same dark mist that had crept in from outside. It was as if the house itself was closing them in. Suddenly, the shadows coiled around them, constricting the air, making it difficult to breathe. The house wasn't just shifting locations, it was becoming a prison. Every corner of it, every inch of the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, as if it had a mind of its own. A mind that was set on trapping them, trapping all of them. A voice echoed from somewhere deep within the house, low and guttural. It was almost a whisper, but the words were clear, and they chilled Sarah to her very core. Leave. The voice was not human, not in any way she had ever heard before. It was ancient, as though it had been carried on the winds of time itself, reaching out from the darkness to claim them. Leave or become one of us. A cold, terrible realization hit Sarah in that moment. The house didn't just move for no reason. It wasn't shifting because of something random. It was searching for something specific. And once it found it, it would stop, only to claim whatever it had found, whether it was a person or perhaps something far darker. The house, now aware of their presence, was ready. It would not stop moving until it had everything it wanted. The walls groaned again, but this time, it wasn't the wood creaking under pressure. It was as if the very structure of the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. And as the shadows reached out, pulling everything toward them, Sarah realized that the house was not only searching for them, it was hunting them. The shadows writhed and slithered across the floor, creeping towards Sarah and her family with unnatural speed. The tendrils of darkness twisted and coiled like snakes, their edges frayed, as if they had been waiting for this moment to strike. A deep, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the walls, the house groaning under some invisible weight. Sarah felt a coldness grip her chest, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. The voice, that terrible, hollow whisper, echoed again from the heart of the house, the words wrapping around her like a vice. "You belong to me now." Tom grabbed her arm, his face pale, eyes wild with fear. "We have to get out of here. There's no other way. We have to find an exit." But the walls, they were closing in. The air thickened with every passing second, becoming heavier, suffocating. It felt like the house itself was contracting, pulling everything inward, drawing them deeper into its labyrinthine belly. No matter how hard they searched, no matter how many doors they tried to open, everything was the same. There was no escape. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve, her small voice barely a whisper. "Mom, what's happening? Why is the house doing this?" Sarah crouched down beside her daughter, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know, sweetie, but we're going to be okay. We're going to find a way out. I promise." But deep down, Sarah knew there was no way out. Not without confronting whatever the house was searching for. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Sarah could see her breath misting in front of her. The shadows moved faster now, stretching across the floor like liquid smoke, sliding up the walls and ceiling. It was as though the house was alive, its very structure shifting, bending, warping around them. The creaks and groans from the house were no longer just sounds. They were the noises of a creature in distress, of something desperately trying to rearrange itself. Tom was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "What do we do? How do we get out of this? This place, it's alive, Sarah. It's like it has a mind of its own." A shrill screeching noise filled the air suddenly, piercing through the suffocating silence. The walls shook violently, rattling the windows and the doorframe. It felt like an earthquake, but worse, like the house was tearing itself apart from the inside. Sarah looked to Tom, her heart racing. "We have to." But before she could finish, the shadows surged forward, faster than she could react. One of the tendrils wrapped around Emily's ankle, yanking her backward with a force that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward as her daughter was dragged away, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong. "No!" Tom cried out, running to his daughter, but the shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, alive with a dark force that seemed to feed on their fear, their desperation. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for Emily, but the more she pulled, the more the shadows tightened around her. She could hear Emily's terrified sobs as she struggled to break free, but the darkness held her firm, dragging her toward the center of the room. The walls seemed to close in around them, as if the house itself was squeezing them into its grasp. The voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "It's time for you to belong." The floor beneath their feet shuddered, as though the house was preparing for something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. Sarah could feel the pulse of the house, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, thumping in time with her own racing pulse. "We need to fight back," Tom said, his voice raw with panic. He grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it toward the tendrils, but the shadow recoiled, almost as if it were alive, avoiding the light. "We need something stronger." The house trembled again, more violently this time. The air was growing thick, almost suffocating. Sarah tried to reach Emily again, but the shadows pulled her back. Her daughter's face was twisted in terror, her small body jerking in the grip of the darkness. "I can't lose her," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She reached down, grabbing the edge of a table, and with a grunt of effort, she shoved it toward the shadows. But it was futile. The table was pulled under as well, swallowed by the darkness. There was no fighting this. Suddenly an idea hit Sarah, a desperate, terrible idea. She had to confront the house, confront whatever had caused this madness. She had to find the source of its hunger, its need to shift and change. Her eyes darted around the room, searching, until they landed on the staircase leading to the attic. The shadows weren't reaching toward it. It was the only place left untouched by the dark tendrils that now filled the room. "Tom," she shouted, her voice shaking with urgency. "The attic. We need to get to the attic." Tom hesitated, looking at her with wide, panicked eyes. "Are you crazy? That's where it's coming from. The source is up there. We can't go near it." But Sarah was already moving toward the stairs, ignoring her husband's protest. She didn't care what was up there anymore. If they didn't confront this, whatever it was, they would be swallowed by the house, lost forever. With one last, desperate glance at her family, Sarah began to climb the stairs. Her heart thudded in her chest as she ascended, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder as she reached the top, and the whispers from the house grew louder, more urgent. "Come closer," the voice whispered, the tone almost welcoming, as if it were coaxing her to step closer, to give in. But Sarah didn't stop. She reached the door to the attic and hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel the pressure from the house building, a suffocating weight that pressed in from all sides. But she forced herself to turn the handle, pushing the door open. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the narrow, cracked windows. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim light, but there was something else, a presence, something ancient and malignant that had been hidden up here all this time. And then she saw it, the heart of the house, the source of its dark hunger. A large wooden chest sat in the center of the room, surrounded by faded, yellowed symbols that had been etched into the floor. The chest was old, ancient, but it wasn't just the wood that sent a chill down her spine. It was the dark energy that emanated from it, the sense that something alive was contained inside. She could feel it. The house wasn't just searching for them, it was searching for the chest, for whatever was locked inside. And now the house was close, too close. The shadows surged forward, reaching toward Sarah, desperate to claim her. The voice whispered one last time, soft and seductive. "Come closer, Sarah. It's waiting for you." The shadows surged forward, the tendrils of darkness like grasping hands, clawing at the air around Sarah. They coiled around the doorway, slithering into the attic, seeking her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, the pulse of fear pounding in her ears. She could feel the weight of the house pushing down on her, the air thick and oppressive, almost suffocating. But she couldn't stop. Not now. With every inch she moved closer to the chest, the shadows writhed faster, more violently. It was as if they knew, as if the house knew, that she was nearing the source of its hunger. The room itself felt colder, the temperature plummeting as a deep, almost sorrowful sound reverberated through the walls. It was like the house was mourning something, a long-lost, forgotten thing that had once been part of it. The whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. "Come closer, Sarah. The chest calls to you." She swallowed hard, but the words clawed at her mind. It felt as though the chest was not just an object, but a presence, a living, breathing force that had been locked away for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The walls groaned as though the house itself was trying to reach her, to pull her back. The temperature dropped further, and Sarah could see her breath misting in the air. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the chest, the wood cold and smooth under her touch. "Do you want to know what's inside, Sarah?" The voice whispered again, closer now, like it was right behind her. She shuddered but didn't pull away. She had to know. She had to understand why the house was doing this, why it was hunting them, why it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. And then, with a deep breath, Sarah lifted the heavy lid of the chest. At first, nothing happened. The room seemed to hold its breath, the shadows momentarily still. Sarah peered inside, her eyes widening as she saw what lay there. The chest wasn't empty. Inside, nestled within old, tattered cloth, was a stone. It was small, no bigger than the palm of her hand, but it was the strangest stone she had ever seen. It was smooth, black as night, but shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The stone seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, beating in time with her own. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the cool surface, and a sudden shock of energy surged through her body. The world around her tilted, and for a split second, everything went silent. The house stopped groaning. The shadows froze. The air grew still. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath. And then, everything shattered. The walls screamed as they cracked open, the floor beneath her feet trembling. The shadows writhed in agony, as though they were being torn apart from the inside out. The house was screaming, and Sarah realized that she had just unlocked something far worse than she could have ever imagined. "No," she gasped, pulling her hand away from the stone, but the damage was already done. The pulse of energy she had felt had awakened something. Something ancient, something far more dangerous than the house itself. The shadows swirled violently, colliding with one another as if they were fighting against an invisible force. The house trembled again, louder this time, as the air around Sarah grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The stone in the chest pulsed in her hand, its glow intensifying with every passing second. And then, with a loud, deafening crack, the walls exploded. Pieces of wood and plaster flew across the room, and Sarah was thrown backward, her body crashing into the far wall. She gasped for air, disoriented, as a screeching sound filled the room, a sound like something being torn apart. Tom's voice broke through the chaos. "Sarah!" She looked up to see him running toward her, his face filled with fear. The house, once again, was alive, but this time it was different. The shadows had come alive, taking on forms, twisting and contorting into shapes that defied reality. The air was thick with a presence that made Sarah's skin crawl. Tom grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet, his grip firm despite the chaos around them. "We need to get out. Now." But it was too late. The house was no longer a place. It was a hunting ground. As they turned to flee, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The shadows had surrounded them, cutting off any chance of escape. Sarah felt the pressure rise again, the air tightening in her lungs. The house was closing in. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet opened up with a horrible cracking sound, and black tendrils shot up from the gap, wrapping around their ankles. Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the house. The tendrils tightened, dragging them down toward the floor. Emily and Ethan's terrified faces appeared through the haze, their eyes wide with panic. "Mom! Dad!" But before Sarah could reach out, the shadows surged forward, engulfing the children. Their screams echoed in the air as the darkness swallowed them whole. "No!" Sarah screamed, struggling against the shadows, but it was no use. They were too strong, too powerful. The tendrils had them now. Her family was being torn away, ripped from her in a way that made her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. The voice returned, low and mocking, echoing through the attic. "You've opened it. You've released it. You belong to me now." The house began to pulse again, the very walls shaking with the rhythm of its hunger. The stone in Sarah's hand pulsed, brighter now, almost blinding in its intensity. "We all belong to me now." The house shuddered with one last, terrible groan, and the shadows surged forward, pulling everything into the heart of the house. The walls closed in, crushing everything in their path. Sarah's world went dark. The darkness swallowed Sarah whole. It wasn't the comforting kind of darkness, the one that existed at night or when the lights were simply turned off. This was a suffocating, crushing absence, a place where even sound couldn't escape. It felt like the house was closing around her, its very walls pulling her into a void that had no beginning and no end. Her breath was shallow, panic rising in her chest. She tried to move, to call out, but her limbs were heavy, like they were submerged underwater. The stone she still clutched in her hand felt warmer now, almost burning against her palm, but it did nothing to comfort her. It was as if the house itself had become a living thing, feeding off her fear, her despair. In the pitch-black void, she could hear the whispers again, those same hollow, haunting voices that had tormented her since the moment they stepped foot in the house. They slithered through her mind, wrapping themselves around her thoughts, their words scraping her sanity with each passing second. "You belong to me." It was the same voice, but now it was different, stronger, closer. The walls pressed in tighter, the air suffocating, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might lose herself entirely. But then, through the suffocating blackness, a flicker of light appeared, small at first, like a distant star, but growing stronger with every breath she took. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but the light remained, pushing back the darkness. The stone pulsed in her hand again. A hum, deep and resonating, filled the air, like something ancient and terrible was awakening. Sarah could feel it now. Something was moving through the house, something was calling to her. But this time, it wasn't the house. This time, it was something inside her, deep in her bones. "Sarah," the voice was soft now, almost loving, coaxing her closer. She felt an undeniable pull toward it, like the house was calling her to come closer, to embrace whatever it had awakened. But then, as if sensing her hesitation, the shadows lunged. They reached for her, wrapping around her body like icy chains. They pulled at her, dragging her through the darkened void, deeper into the heart of the house, to where it all began. Her pulse raced. The shadows pressed tighter, choking her with their grip. "No," she gasped, struggling, but the shadows only tightened their hold, forcing her forward. "Stop! Let me go!" The light ahead grew brighter, stronger, until Sarah realized with a horrible jolt that the light was not just a light, it was a lantern. The house had been searching for this. The lantern, the widow's lantern. In the distance, barely visible through the haze of darkness, she saw the outline of a figure. It was a woman, pale and ghostly, her face gaunt, her features blurred by the mist that swirled around her. The woman's hand was outstretched, holding the lantern, its light illuminating the room with an eerie glow. "You," the woman's voice whispered, her tone cold and haunting, like a wind sweeping over a forgotten grave. "You freed me." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had known. Deep down, she had always known that the house had been searching for something. But she had never imagined that it was looking for a spirit, a ghost, a widow that had been trapped for centuries. The lantern's light flickered as the woman stepped closer. The shadows recoiled from her, as though they were afraid of the light, afraid of her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, trapped by the woman's gaze. "You woke me." The widow's voice was like ice, a slow, deliberate whisper. "You called me back. Now you will join me forever." Sarah's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The shadows pulsed around her, tightening their grip. The widow reached out, her fingers cold and pale as death itself, and touched Sarah's face. "It is time to go." The moment the widow's fingers made contact with her skin, Sarah felt a jolt of cold shoot through her body. It was as if her soul itself was being torn from her body, pulled into the lantern, into the woman's grasp. "No!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The woman's eyes glowed with a fierce, ghostly light. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. She had waited for this moment for centuries, for someone to open the chest and release her. The house had been her prison, and now she was free. Sarah felt herself falling, her body no longer under her control. Her mind screamed as she tried to break free, but the shadows were everywhere now. They swarmed her, pulling her toward the lantern, toward the woman, toward the eternal darkness. Her vision blurred as she was consumed by the light. The last thing she saw was the woman's smile, growing wider, more malevolent, as Sarah was swallowed by the glow. And then everything went silent. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that felt like a thick blanket, smothering every sound, every thought. Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, pushing down on her, as though the very air around her had turned to lead. Her mind struggled to grasp what had just happened. The woman, the lantern, the shadows. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake from, a terrible dream spiraling out of control. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though it no longer belonged to her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except exist in this crushing, suffocating space. Her heart raced, the only sign of life in the overwhelming stillness. The darkness was around her, within her. She could feel it crawling beneath her skin, twisting through her very being. The house was still there, its presence looming over her like a massive weight, pressing in from all sides. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. It was the same voice, the widow's voice, but now it was different. It was closer. "You are mine now, Sarah. Forever." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to fight, but there was nothing left of her strength. The house had already claimed her. She was trapped, bound to it, just like the others who had come before her. The whisper echoed through her mind again, louder this time, more insistent. "You will never escape." The woman's words were like poison, seeping into her thoughts, eating away at her resolve. Sarah felt the darkness tightening around her, as though the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Suddenly, the pressure in the air lifted, just enough to make her head spin. The lantern's light flickered in front of her again, its soft glow cutting through the darkness. It was as if it were pulling her toward it, drawing her in, like a moth to a flame. The widow's figure appeared before her, her face pale and cold, her expression unreadable. "Come closer, Sarah." The voice was like ice, cold and smooth, but there was an undeniable command in it. "You cannot fight it. You cannot run. You are mine now." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, as if reaching out, yearning for her. She could feel the pull, the unmistakable urge to surrender, to give in. The house wanted her, needed her. It was only a matter of time before it had her completely. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. I won't let you take me." The widow's eyes flashed with something sharp, amusement, maybe even pity. She tilted her head, studying Sarah like a child might study a toy before breaking it. "You still think you have a choice?" The widow's voice lowered to a whisper. "There is no escape." Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The widow stepped closer, the lantern now just inches from her face. She could feel its heat, the warmth radiating from it as if it had a life of its own. A strange, oppressive power pulsed through the air, thick and suffocating. In a desperate, last attempt, Sarah reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of the lantern. The moment she touched it, a shock ran through her body. It was a searing pain, like fire coursing through her veins, spreading through her very soul. She gasped, unable to pull away. "Don't resist." The widow's voice was cold, unfeeling. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this." The shadows surged around Sarah, wrapping themselves tighter around her body, pulling her toward the widow, toward the lantern. She could feel it. The house, the stone, the widow. They were all one, a single entity, a force of ancient evil that had been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to claim its prize. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts frantic, desperate. She had to break free. She had to save her family. She had to. And then suddenly everything stopped. The shadows froze. The lantern's light flickered out. The widow, too, seemed to pause, as though something had interrupted the flow of time itself. In the silence, Sarah heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. She turned, eyes wide, as a figure appeared out of the darkness, stepping into the faint light. It was Tom, her husband. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but he was alive. He had to be. "Tom!" Sarah cried out, her voice weak, but filled with a surge of hope. "Tom, please, help me." Tom's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a flash of the man she loved. But then his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and a strange, unfamiliar look crossed his face. "Sarah," his voice was distant, hollow. "You shouldn't have come here." A chill crawled down Sarah's spine. This wasn't the man she knew. This wasn't her husband. What do you mean?" she stammered, confusion and fear flooding her chest. "Tom, please. I need you. We need to leave." Tom's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker, more twisted, a smile that sent a shiver through Sarah's entire being. "It's too late." He stepped forward, and Sarah took a step back, her body trembling. "You opened the door. You freed her. And now," his voice trailed off as he gestured to the widow, "now you belong to her too." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look at the widow, whose ghostly figure was now standing between her and Tom, the lantern still glowing faintly in her hands. The widow's lips curved into a smile, her eyes glittering with malice. "You see, Sarah," the widow said, her voice dripping with venom, "your husband was never truly free. He's been part of this house, part of me, for as long as it has existed. Just like you will be." "No," Sarah whispered, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. "Yes," the widow replied, her voice colder than ever. "And now there's no way out. Not for any of us." As the words sank in, Sarah felt a terrible, crushing weight in her chest. She had opened the door. She had released something that could never be contained. And now there was no escape. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the heavy thud of it almost deafening in the silence. Her eyes darted between Tom and the widow, the truth sinking in like ice water, chilling her to the bone. The house had always been more than just a house. It was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Waiting for them. Her eyes desperately searched Tom's face, but it was like looking at a stranger. This wasn't the man she married. This wasn't the father of her children. He stood there, his expression empty, as if he had been hollowed out and filled with something else entirely. "Tom, please," she whispered, her voice breaking, pleading. "This isn't you. Please come back." But he didn't move. His eyes were cold, distant, and he didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he took a slow step toward the widow, who watched him with an eerie, knowing smile. There was something deeply unsettling in the way they both interacted, as if they shared a connection far older and darker than anything Sarah could understand. The widow's voice was soft, coaxing. "He knows, Sarah. He's known from the beginning." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "No." Her voice was trembling. "No, you're lying. He's not. He's not like you." But the widow's smile only grew. "Cold, empty, cruel. He's mine, just as you will be." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled back, almost tripping over the floorboards, but she caught herself just in time. Panic surged through her, the fight-or-flight response kicking in. She had to get away. She had to escape, but her legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the shadows were everywhere, encroaching, closing in. The house was no longer a place. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that would never let her go. "You can't escape, Sarah." Tom's voice came from behind her, hollow and emotionless. "Not now. You've already given yourself to it." Sarah turned to face him. His eyes glinted with something dark, something that wasn't him at all. His lips parted, revealing a smile that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. The house had claimed him, just as it was trying to claim her. The widow extended a hand, her skeletal fingers beckoning. "Come closer, Sarah. It's time." The words were a poison, sinking into Sarah's mind, clouding her thoughts. She could feel the tug, strong, unrelenting, pulling her toward the widow, toward the lantern. She didn't want to go. She couldn't go, but her body betrayed her. Her feet moved of their own accord, stepping slowly, unwillingly toward the widow. "Sarah, no!" Tom's voice shattered the silence like glass, his tone desperate now, desperate in a way that felt so wrong. "Don't go to her. You have to fight it. Please fight it." It was as if the words were a distant echo, fading before they even reached her ears. The house had already claimed him. Her warning was empty, futile. And now, she felt herself being swallowed whole by the same dark pull that had taken him. The widow stepped forward, her bony hand still extended. The lantern between them pulsed with an unnatural glow, its light flickering like the last dying breath of a flame. The widow's voice was a whisper, a hiss of sound that slithered through Sarah's mind. "There is no escape for you now, Sarah. You are mine. You are ours. Forever." Sarah's vision blurred as the coldness in the air deepened. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls exhaling in rhythm with her labored breath. It was as if the entire house was coming alive, its dark energy swirling, seeping into her skin, filling her with an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. And then the whisper came again, so soft, so close, as though it were right in her ear. "The house is not your enemy, Sarah. It's your salvation. It has always been waiting for you." Suddenly, a loud crack pierced the silence, followed by the sound of wood splintering. The walls groaned and shook, as if the house itself were in pain. Sarah froze, turning toward the sound. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadows began to shift, twisting unnaturally, as though they were alive, as though they were stretching and reaching for something. "What's happening?" she whispered, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. The widow's face twitched, her smile faltering. She glanced around, her eyes narrowing. No, this wasn't part of the plan. For the first time, a hint of fear crept into her voice. But it was brief, fleeting, swallowed quickly by the darkness that enveloped them. The house shook again, louder this time, its foundations rattling as though it were about to crumble. The light in the lantern flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. It wasn't just the house that was shifting now. The very air felt like it was changing, like something ancient was stirring, awakening. The ground beneath Sarah's feet shifted. The house was moving. Again. But this time it felt different. "No, not yet," the widow muttered under her breath, her eyes wide in panic. "Not now." The walls groaned again, this time with a deafening crash. The house seemed to be buckling under some unseen force, its wood splintering and cracking as the lantern's light flared up, bright and terrifying. Sarah felt herself being pulled backward, dragged away from the widow and toward the center of the room, where the floor was now cracking open, revealing the darkness below. For a moment, the widow hesitated, her eyes flickering to Sarah with a mix of frustration and something else, fear. And in that brief moment, Sarah saw it. A flicker of humanity in her eyes, a shred of a soul that hadn't completely been consumed by the house. But then, the house shook once more, and the lantern's light flared with an intensity that made Sarah's skin burn. The widow's face twisted in rage, and she screamed in fury, her voice rising in a screech that shattered the air. "You think you can escape me?" Before Sarah could react, the house shifted, its walls groaning and cracking under the immense pressure. And then everything stopped. The house froze. The shadows froze. The world itself froze. In that moment of stillness, Sarah heard it. A voice. Faint. Distant. But unmistakable. "Run." It was Tom's voice, but different. It was desperate, urgent. Something in his tone told Sarah this was not the same hollow shell she had seen before. "Run, Sarah. Get out now." Her heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to obey. But as her eyes darted to the widow, Sarah realized that her only chance for survival lay in the very thing she had been running from. The house was no longer just an entity. It was something worse. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears, louder than the distant rumble of the house's shifting foundation. The voice, Tom's voice, was fading, barely audible now, but its urgency was clear. "Run." The word echoed through her mind, again and again, like a warning bell that refused to stop ringing. Her eyes locked onto the widow, who stood still, her body rigid with a strange mixture of rage and fear. The lantern's light had dimmed, but its cold glow still lit the room with an eerie, unnatural brightness. The air smelled of damp wood and something far worse, decay, death, the scent of something that had been buried for far too long. Sarah could feel it in her bones, the heaviness in the air, the ancient, suffocating weight of the house around her. And then it hit her. The house was alive, but it wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that fed on something. On souls. She could see the fear in the widow's eyes now, clearer than before. The widow wasn't just a spirit. She wasn't just an ancient ghost. She was a prisoner, too. The house had claimed her long ago, just as it had claimed Tom. And now it was coming for her. "Get out, Sarah. Get out now." Tom's voice again, clearer this time, stronger. Her breath caught in her throat, the panic surging up her spine. She had to run. She had to escape. With trembling hands, she turned and bolted for the door. But as she reached for the handle, she felt something cold, like icy fingers wrapping around her wrist, holding her in place. She screamed, trying to wrench free, but the grip tightened, unrelenting, as if the house itself had a hold of her. She spun around, and there, standing just inches away from her, was the widow. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in an expression of unbelievable fury. The widow's pale fingers tightened around Sarah's wrist, pulling her back toward the center of the room. "You cannot leave." The widow's voice was thick with malice, cold as stone. "I will not let you go." The room seemed to shift again, the floor beneath Sarah's feet vibrating with the pressure of the house's movement. But this time, it wasn't just the house moving, it was the very air itself. It was like the walls were closing in, folding, stretching, as if the house were trying to swallow her whole. Nothing felt solid anymore. It was as if the world itself was folding in on her, turning into a nightmarish, distorted version of reality. Sarah struggled, fighting to free herself from the widow's grip, but it was useless. The widow's strength was overwhelming, unnatural, like the force of the house itself was behind it. "Let go of me," Sarah cried out, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, her lungs struggling for air, as though the house was trying to suffocate her. But the widow didn't listen. Instead, she drew Sarah closer, her eyes glowing with something ancient, something terrifying. "You're mine now. You all are." The widow's lips curled into a twisted smile, her teeth sharp and unnatural. "You'll never leave. None of you ever will." Sarah gasped, the realization hitting her like a cold slap. The house, this house, wasn't just a prison. It was a trap, and once it had claimed you, you were never meant to escape. The walls around her seemed to grow tighter, pressing in from all sides. Sarah could feel the pressure, the oppression, the weight of the house closing in on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She was suffocating, trapped, consumed by the same darkness that had taken Tom, the same darkness that had swallowed the widow. And then she heard it again, Tom's voice, clearer. "Sarah, run." Her head whipped around, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. Tom was there, but this time he was different. His form was blurred, his face stretched, distorted, like he was struggling to hold on to something real. His body flickered, the edges of him wavering like a mirage. "Please." His voice was desperate now, as if he were fighting against something unseen, something that was dragging him down. "You have to run. Don't let it take you." She could see it now, the struggle in his eyes, the agony in his face. Tom wasn't gone, not completely. He was still there, still fighting. But whatever had taken hold of him, whatever was consuming him, was strong. And Sarah realized then that there was something worse than death. Something far worse than being claimed by the house. It was being trapped within it. She had to move. She couldn't think. She just had to run. With every ounce of strength left in her, she ripped herself free from the widow's grasp and ran for the door. Her legs were weak, her body exhausted from the struggle, but she pushed forward, her every movement frantic, fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. The door was just ahead. She could see the faint light of the outside world shining through the cracks. Freedom, escape, life. But then, just as her fingers brushed the handle, the room shook violently, sending her crashing to the ground. The air was thick with the sound of creaking wood and groaning walls, as if the house were coming to life, trying to devour her whole. She screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the house itself, the earth-shaking, heart-rending sound of its fury. And then it happened. The lantern flared to life, glowing brighter than ever before, casting everything in an unearthly light. The widow was standing in front of her again, blocking the door, her face a mask of fury. Her body shimmered in the lantern's glow, her form becoming almost ethereal, like she was part of the house now, part of something much older, much more powerful than Sarah could ever imagine. "You can't run. You can't hide." The widow's voice was a low, twisted melody, like a song that had been sung too many times, its meaning lost to the ages. "This is your home now. This is where you belong." And with that, the door slammed shut. The walls groaned, the house shrieked, and Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her once again. It was as though the very earth was moving, twisting, bending to swallow her whole. But then, just as the house seemed to consume her, Sarah heard it, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, clearer. The sound of footsteps. They were coming toward her. The footsteps were growing closer. It was Tom. The footsteps grew louder, each step echoing through the room like a heartbeat in the silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her pulse pounding in her ears. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. Tom's form flickered again in the corner of her vision. She spun around, her heart racing, her breath shallow. It was Tom, but not the man she had known. This was someone or something else. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his expression was twisted with something darker, something that shouldn't have been there. His face was contorted in pain, his lips pulled back in an agonizing grimace. "Sarah," his voice was strained, as though it were being pulled from deep within him, his words breaking as they passed through his lips. "Sarah, I'm sorry." She wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, to tell him it was going to be okay. But something in his gaze told her to stay back. The light in his eyes, there was no life in it, no humanity. It was just a reflection of the house, the same darkness that consumed everything it touched. And Sarah knew deep down that this wasn't her husband anymore. This wasn't Tom. Her hands trembled as she backed away, each step bringing her farther from him, farther from the reality she had once known. "You have to leave, Sarah." His voice was barely a whisper now, distorted, like it was being swallowed by the house. "The house it's taking everything." Sarah's eyes widened in terror. The walls around her groaned, their weight pressing in on her, as if the house itself was listening. She could feel it, the sense that the house was closing in, tightening around her. Every breath she took was heavier than the last, and the air seemed to grow thick with something ancient, something that hadn't been disturbed in centuries. "No, not again," she whispered, her chest tightening. The house wasn't just moving anymore. It wasn't just shifting. It was hunting her. It was looking for her. She looked back at Tom, no, at the thing that had once been her husband, and saw that his form was blurring now, his body dissolving into the shadows. The air around him seemed to warp, distorting as if he were slipping through a crack in reality itself. "Tom, please," she cried, her voice desperate. But there was no answer, just the relentless pounding of her own heart, and the terrible sound of the house's shifting walls. Suddenly she heard a sound, faint at first but unmistakable. A whisper. The lantern. The widow's voice. Soft. Tempting. "Come closer, Sarah. We've been waiting for you." The pull of the lantern's light was undeniable. It called to her like a siren song, promising an end to the torment, to the pain. The house was still shifting around her, its walls creaking and groaning, but in that moment, the lantern's glow seemed like the only constant, the only escape. But Sarah knew. She knew. There was no escape. There would never be an escape. The widow's form flickered and twisted like a mirage, her figure growing more distorted with each passing second. The air around her shimmered, the temperature dropping, the darkness thickening. "You think you can run?" the widow hissed, her voice rising in pitch, growing harsher. "You think you can escape what you've already given to the house?" Sarah staggered backward, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to fight. She had to fight back. The lantern's light intensified, and Sarah's vision began to blur. Her body felt heavy, as if the very weight of the house were pressing down on her chest. The widow was standing before her now, her cold, skeletal fingers stretching toward her, inching closer and closer. Her lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You belong to us now." The widow's voice was a low growl, a promise of something far worse than death. "The house will never let you go." The walls shook once again, and the floor beneath Sarah's feet buckled. She gasped as the floorboard beneath her cracked, splintering open like an old wound. Dark tendrils of shadow reached up from the floor, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down, dragging her toward the darkness. "No!" Sarah screamed, her hands clawing at the air, trying to pull herself free, but the shadows held her firm. They were cold, unnaturally cold, and the more she struggled, the tighter they gripped her. The widow's laugh echoed through the room, an unsettling sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The lantern's light flared brighter, bathing everything in its sickly glow. The house was alive. It was feeding. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The shadows closed in on her, enveloping her. She felt the cold of the walls, the suffocating darkness, as the very house seemed to swallow her whole. Her hands were slick with sweat as she tried to tear herself free from the grasp of the shadows. She had to fight. She had to survive. And then, through the blackness, she heard it, the voice. The same voice that had warned her. The same voice that had called her to escape. Tom's voice. "Sarah, it's not too late. You can fight it. You can still escape." His voice sounded different now, stronger, more clear. But there was a faint undertone of desperation, of pain, as if the very act of speaking was tearing him apart. "Listen to me, Sarah. You have to fight." The shadows around her seemed to hesitate, to shift. For a moment, the house paused, as if caught between two worlds. One where Sarah could escape, and one where she would be lost forever. The widow's form flickered, her eyes narrowing, as if she were sensing the change. The house felt different now, like it was fighting itself, struggling against something it couldn't control. Tom's voice cut through the noise, clear and loud now. "Fight, Sarah. Fight the house." With a cry of desperation, Sarah gathered every ounce of strength she had left. She pulled her hands free from the shadows and sprinted toward the door, toward freedom. She could see it now, a crack in the darkness, a sliver of light just beyond the door. Hope. The widow shrieked in fury as Sarah ran. The house groaned, its walls trembling, the foundation of it shaking under the pressure of something breaking free. But it was too late. Sarah was already at the door. With one last, desperate lunge, Sarah threw herself at the door. Her fingers gripped the handle, her palms slick with sweat, and with a twist, she yanked it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound high-pitched and shrill, as if the house itself were mourning her escape. But there was no turning back now. She stumbled out into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air hit her skin like a slap, sharp and biting, but it was real, it was alive. The darkness of the house loomed behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Every part of her screamed to keep running, to never stop, to never let the shadows catch up to her. The moon hung high in the sky, pale and distant, its light casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she ran, her legs aching with every step, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let the house pull her back in. She could feel it, the pull, the weight of it, stretching toward her, trying to drag her back into its grip. But she was free now. She had to be. Her mind was clouded with panic, but in the distance, she could see the lights of the nearby town. Freedom. She wasn't far now. She could make it. She had to. Just as the thought crossed her mind, a cold gust of wind rushed past her, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of the house shifting. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of rot. The voice of the widow, louder now, clearer, echoed through the night. "You can't run, Sarah." It was a low, cruel whisper, like 1,000 voices layered over each other, each one more desperate than the last. "You are already part of this place." Her heart skipped a beat, her feet faltering as the shadows behind her began to stretch, reaching out, grasping at the edges of her vision. She spun around, and for a brief moment she saw it, a flicker. The lantern's light, glowing faintly in the distance, flickering like a dying star. The house was coming for her. The earth beneath her feet seemed to shift, the ground growing uneven as the house moved, bending the very land around it. It was impossible. It was as if the house itself was pulling the land toward it, the earth warping under its influence. The ground cracked open, and from the deep crevices, shadows reached up, writhing like serpents. The house had followed her. It wasn't done. It would never be done. "No," Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. She forced herself to keep running, her legs burning with exhaustion, but the sound of the house, the shifting, groaning, suffocating sound, was closer now. It was right behind her. She dared a glance over her shoulder, and her blood ran cold. The house wasn't just standing still anymore. It was moving, crawling toward her, its walls rippling like flesh, the windows warped and gaping, and from every crevice there were eyes that watched her, eyes that saw into her very soul. "You can't outrun us." The widow's voice again, clearer this time. "We are everywhere." Sarah's chest tightened, the air suffocating as the shadows seemed to close in from all sides. She was running out of time. The ground was giving way beneath her feet, and she could feel herself slipping, as if the earth itself was turning on her, trying to pull her into its depths. Then, through the dark veil of trees, she saw it, a light. A car's headlights, barely visible, just ahead. She wasn't alone. There were others. "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. She ran toward the light, her breath ragged, each step bringing her closer to the safety she had almost believed was impossible to reach. But just as she reached the clearing, her foot caught on something, a root, a rock, anything, and she collapsed, tumbling forward, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. She barely had time to react before a shadow loomed over her, dark and heavy, blocking out the light. The ground beneath her shifted again, and the earth trembled, sending cracks through the dirt like a web of jagged veins. She looked up. Standing above her, looming in the dim light, was Tom. But not the Tom she had known. This Tom was different. His eyes were completely black now, no longer the familiar warmth she had once loved. His mouth was open, but the words that came from it were not his, were not human. "You were supposed to stay." His voice was like the sound of 1,000 whispers, distorted and wrong. "We were all supposed to stay." Sarah's body trembled in fear as she scrambled backward, trying to push herself up. But the ground beneath her feet wasn't solid anymore. It was soft like sand, shifting and pulling her downward. "It's too late, Sarah." Tom's voice broke, a sad, unnatural growl. "You're part of it now. There's no going back." The ground trembled violently, and the house loomed overhead, towering like a dark behemoth, its shadow swallowing everything in its path. The house was here, and it wasn't leaving. The earth beneath Sarah's hands cracked open, revealing a chasm of darkness below, a bottomless pit that seemed to stretch forever. From the depths, shadows reached up, clawing at her, pulling her closer to the abyss. "Please!" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face, her voice raw with fear and desperation. "Help me!" But there was no help, no rescue. Only the house and the darkness that had claimed Tom, that had claimed them all. She could feel the pull of the earth beneath her, the cold, suffocating grip of the shadows closing in around her, wrapping around her limbs, dragging her down into the endless black. And then, all at once, the darkness swallowed her whole. Name of the next story, The Whispering Fog. The town of Grey Hollow had always been a quiet place. Nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by thick forests and tall, imposing mountains, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. The air was always crisp, and the scent of pine trees filled the streets. Most of the time, life moved slowly here, like the soft river that ran through the outskirts. People would wave as they passed each other on the sidewalks, and the sound of children laughing echoed through the alleys as they played. It was peaceful, until the fog came. It started in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. At first, it seemed harmless, just a light mist creeping in from the east, curling around the town like a veil. But the mist was thick, thicker than any fog the town had seen before. And as it rolled in, it brought something with it, a sound, a whisper. It started low, almost imperceptible, like a breeze brushing through the trees. But soon it grew louder, rising in pitch, until the whispers seemed to fill the air. They were strange, too soft to make out, yet familiar. They seemed to come from nowhere, and yet everywhere at once. At first, the people of Grey Hollow thought it was just their imagination. Fog, after all, had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But as the hours passed, the whispers became impossible to ignore. The first person to disappear was Clara Jenkins. Clara was known to be a kind woman, a schoolteacher who had lived in Grey Hollow all her life. She had been walking home from the general store when the fog closed in around her. The whispers, too faint to understand, had called to her, luring her into the depths of the fog. Neighbors reported seeing her at the edge of the street, staring into the fog with a dazed expression. And then, without a word, she walked into the mist and vanished. The townsfolk searched for her all night. They combed the streets, calling her name, but the fog was thick, and no one could see more than a few feet ahead of them. The whispers grew louder, but they offered no direction. And when the fog finally lifted, there was no sign of Clara. It was as if she had never existed. The next morning, the town was on edge. The sheriff, Ray Carter, tried to keep everyone calm, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had been one of the first to hear the whispers. They had started as a faint murmur, but by the time the fog had dissipated, he could swear they were calling his name. By noon, the fog returned. This time, it was even thicker than before. And again, the whispers rose up, louder than ever. The townsfolk had learned nothing from Clara's disappearance. They ventured out into the mist, searching for answers, but the whispers led them deeper, pulling them away from the safety of the town center. One by one, they disappeared. First, it was Mr. Matthews, the barber, then Mrs. Parker, the librarian, and soon after, the town's blacksmith, Hank Dunn. Each time, they vanished into the fog, lured by the whispers that seemed to promise something just out of reach. By the third night, the town was almost empty. Only a handful of people remained. Sheriff Carter, his deputy, Sarah, and a few others, all of them too terrified to leave their homes. The whispers still echoed through the streets, and each one carried a message. "Come closer. Come find us. We are waiting." Sarah, a young woman with sharp instincts, was the first to suggest they leave. But Sheriff Carter dismissed the idea. He had been investigating the disappearances, piecing together the fragments of the clues, but each new disappearance only deepened the mystery. The more he looked into it, the more he began to realize the truth. The fog wasn't just fog. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. The fog was alive. "It's calling them," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The whispers. It's like it's searching for something." Carter nodded slowly, his mind racing. "But what? What does it want?" The answer came to him later that night. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. It whispered through the cracks, and slowly, its voice became clearer. He could hear the faint tones of familiar voices, Clara's, Hank's, even Mr. Matthews. And then, from the depths of the fog, something new called to him, a voice unlike any he had ever heard. It was soft, almost seductive. "Ray," the voice whispered his name. "Come to us, Ray. Come find us." His heart pounded in his chest, and his eyes flew open. He knew then. He had to go into the fog. It was the only way to end it. At dawn, Sheriff Carter and Sarah gathered the remaining townsfolk. They would go into the fog together. They would find out what was behind it. As the group made their way to the edge of town, the fog seemed to part before them, as if it recognized their approach. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a chorus of voices, each one pleading for attention, each one beckoning them forward. "This is insane, Sheriff," one of the townsfolk, a man named Ben, protested. "We can't just walk into that thing. We don't know what it is." Carter turned to him, his expression grim. "It's the only choice we have. Either we face it, or it will keep taking us, one by one." They walked into the fog, the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. The air felt thick, as if the very molecules of it were watching them, waiting. The whispers grew louder still, as if the fog were alive, listening to their every step. Sarah's heart raced as they walked deeper into the mist. The fog seemed to twist around them, drawing them in with an almost magnetic force. And the voices, those haunting, familiar voices, called to them, each whisper carrying a name, a promise, a warning. "Come find me, Sheriff." It was Clara's voice, soft, pleading. "Ray, please. I'm so cold. Come help me." Ben flinched, his eyes darting around, trying to make out shapes in the fog. "I don't like this. It feels like we're walking into something we can't come back from." But they continued, pushing forward. Each step felt heavier, like the very ground beneath their feet was pulling them down, swallowing them whole. The fog pressed against them, thickening, wrapping around them like a shroud. They walked for what felt like hours, the whispers never stopping. And then, suddenly, the fog parted. They found themselves standing in a small clearing, the fog swirling around them in slow, lazy circles. But there, in the center of the clearing, was a figure. A woman, tall, pale, with dark eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She was standing perfectly still, staring at them, her lips slightly parted as though she had been waiting for them. The whispers grew still, as if the fog had stopped breathing, holding its collective breath. Sarah took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The woman smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, like the chill in the fog. "I am the voice. The fog. The one who calls to them." Carter's heart skipped a beat. "What are you?" "I am the one who was left behind." The woman's smile faded, her voice a low, hollow whisper. "The one who was forgotten. I am the whisper in the fog, the one who draws them in." Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever, and Carter felt something cold crawl up his spine. The woman stepped forward, her feet not touching the ground, and the fog thickened around them once more. "You are all mine now," she said, her voice wrapping around them like a vice. "Come, join us. You will never leave." The fog closed in around them, thick and suffocating, as if it were alive, a living thing determined to swallow them whole. The woman, the figure in the center of the clearing, glided toward them, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. Her smile, cold and hollow, never wavered. Carter stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound firm. The woman's laugh echoed around them, a low, chilling sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was as though the fog itself was laughing, mocking them. "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice sweet yet dripping with malice. "I want what you owe me. I want the ones who belong to me. the ones who have walked into my fog and never returned. I want them all. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the whispers swirling around her, like thousands of voices, all overlapping and mingling, calling out her name, their words unintelligible but filled with desperation. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Clara, Hank, the others, they're gone, and they're not coming back." The woman's eyes darkened, and she took another step forward. The air seemed to grow colder still, and the fog pressed in on them, making it impossible to see anything beyond the immediate circle they stood in. "They're not gone, child." The woman's voice was sharp now, like the crack of a whip. "They're with me always. Their voices will never leave the fog. You'll hear them forever, just like you'll hear your own." Carter swallowed hard. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why? Why is this happening? The woman's gaze softened for a brief moment, as though she was remembering something long lost. "Once I was like you." Her voice was almost wistful now. "Once I had a life. I was loved and I was whole. But that was before the fog found me. Before it called me, like it calls all of you." She moved closer still, and the whispers became louder, more urgent. Carter could feel his pulse quickening, his chest tightening. It was as though the very fog was suffocating him, pushing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. He tried to take a step back, but the woman reached out and gripped his arm, her touch cold like ice. "You cannot escape it, Sheriff. You cannot outrun the fog. You can only join it. You will become a voice in the fog, just like the others. You will join the chorus. You will become part of me." Sarah grabbed Carter's arm, pulling him away from the woman, but the fog seemed to hold them in place, as if it were pushing them toward her. The whispers grew louder, and for a moment, Sarah thought she could hear Clara's voice, faint and desperate, calling to her. "Sarah, please help me." "No!" Sarah cried out, shaking her head furiously. "No, we have to leave. We have to get out of here." But the woman was not done yet. She stepped forward once more, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "It's too late for that, child." She raised her arms, and the fog around them seemed to swirl faster, growing thicker, darker. The fog does not let go. It will never let go. Carter looked around, his mind reeling. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt the ground beneath his feet shift, as if the earth itself was moving with the fog. The trees around them, tall, ancient things that had stood for centuries, began to bend, their branches creaking as though they were being pulled toward the woman in the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the fog seemed to pulse, like a living creature breathing in time with their own frantic hearts. "We have to fight this, Carter." Sarah shouted, but even as the words left her lips, she knew how impossible it sounded. They were trapped. There was no escaping the fog, no running from it. The woman, her smile widening, stepped forward again, her presence suffocating. "You cannot fight what you do not understand, Sheriff. The fog knows what you fear. It feeds on it." Carter's breath caught in his throat as he suddenly understood. The fog wasn't just some strange natural phenomenon. It was a force, a malevolent entity, a being that had been waiting for the right moment to consume everything in its path. And now it had found them. The woman raised her hands to the sky, and the fog responded, thickening, curling around them like a living serpent. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. "No!" Carter shouted, the panic rising in his chest. "We won't let you win." He tried to move, but the fog held him in place. The whispers wrapped around him, their voices now a cacophony of sounds, all merging into a single, insistent cry. He could hear Clara's voice again, clearer now, more desperate than ever. "Ray! Ray, come to me. Help me, come find me." Carter clenched his fists, his mind racing. There had to be something he could do, something to stop this madness. But as the fog closed in around them, he felt a strange, overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. It was as though the fog itself was feeding on his fear, growing stronger, more insistent. You cannot stop it. The woman's voice was low, like a death knell. The fog will claim you all. It will claim this town, and it will claim the world. Suddenly, the fog around them surged forward, enveloping them in a cold, swirling mass. Carter could no longer see his hand in front of his face, and the voices, the whispers, grew louder, like 1,000 souls crying out in torment. We're all trapped. Sarah's voice was barely audible, drowned out by the overwhelming noise of the fog. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the woman and the fog began to fade, dissolving into nothingness. The whispers stopped, the fog lifted, and for a brief moment there was silence. But that silence didn't last long. When the fog finally cleared, Carter and Sarah found themselves standing in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by the silhouettes of the town they had once known. The houses, the streets, the people, all were gone. The town had vanished, swallowed whole by the fog, just like the others before it. The air was thick with an eerie stillness. The wind was silent. The birds did not chirp. There was no sign of life anywhere, except for the whispers. "Ray! Sarah! Come back!" It was Clara's voice again, distant, echoing through the stillness. And with it came the realization. The fog had won. The fog was still there, and it was waiting for its next victim. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick and oppressive. Carter's heart raced in his chest, and he felt a cold sweat slick against his back. He could still hear Clara's voice calling out to him, faint and sorrowful, weaving through the stillness like a thread of regret. "Clara," Carter whispered, his voice shaky. He looked around, his eyes straining to make sense of the empty town that surrounded them. It was as if the world had been wiped clean, leaving nothing but the remnants of something that had once existed. A place where life had been, now swallowed by the fog. Sarah grabbed Carter's arm, pulling him away from the center of the clearing. "We need to move. We need to get out of here, now." But as she spoke, Carter noticed something. The ground beneath their feet was different. The soil had a strange, unsettling softness to it, as if it were freshly disturbed, as if something, or someone, had been buried there. His foot brushed against something, and when he looked down, he saw it. A hand. It was pale and skeletal, the fingers curled upward as if reaching for something. The dirt around it was disturbed, as though the earth had been clawed at. Carter stepped back, his blood turning cold. "No," Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was real. They both knew it. The fog, the whispers, the disembodied hand reaching out from the earth. It was all real, and it wasn't over yet. The ground around them shifted, and more hands emerged, skeletal and lifeless, clawing their way to the surface. The fog swirled violently around them, thickening once more, suffocating the air. The voices came back, louder now, overlapping each other, all of them whispering, begging, calling out for help. But there was no help to be found. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears as the ground seemed to ripple beneath him. The whispers began to take on a more sinister tone, twisting and warping, as if the very air around them was alive with malicious intent. "You can't escape us." The voice was cold and distant, but it felt as though it was right next to his ear. "You belong to the fog now." Sarah clutched Carter's arm tighter, her grip shaking. "We need to run. We need to get to the car." But Carter couldn't move. His feet felt like they were rooted to the spot. He could feel the weight of the fog pressing against him, pulling him in, urging him to stay. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could hear the voices of the lost, of Clara, of Hank, of everyone who had vanished. Their cries for help were drowned out by the malevolent force surrounding them. "Ray! Sarah!" Clara's voice came through the fog again, clearer this time. It sounded so real, so desperate. "Please, I need you. Come find me." Carter's chest tightened. He could feel her, hear her, as if she was right in front of him. His heart screamed for him to go to her, to find her. But deep down he knew. He knew that if he went toward that voice, he would never return. The fog would claim him, just as it had claimed the others. It's not real. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, but she was trembling, her face pale with fear. It's the fog, Carter. It's all part of the fog. But even as she said it, she too seemed drawn to the voices. They were all around them now, a chorus of the lost, mingling together in a maddening cacophony. Carter could feel his mind starting to fray, his thoughts becoming tangled with the whispers. It was hard to tell where the fog ended and his own thoughts began. The fog was everywhere, inside him, around him, wrapping its tendrils around his mind, pulling him deeper into its grasp. "No!" Carter shouted, shaking his head violently, trying to break free of the fog's influence. "We can't listen to them, Sarah. We can't." But the whispers were relentless, and with each passing moment, they grew louder, more desperate, more pleading. "Ray, come to me," Clara's voice called again, so close now like she was standing right next to him. "Please help me." He stumbled forward, unable to resist. His body moved on its own, as if the fog had taken control of his limbs. But just as he was about to step deeper into the fog, a cold, iron grip clamped down on his arm. "No, Carter," Sarah cried out, pulling him back. "You can't listen to it. Don't listen." But it was too late. The fog surged forward, engulfing them both in its dense, suffocating embrace. The whispers, now a deafening roar, filled their ears. Carter felt the ground beneath him start to give way, and he tried to fight against it, to break free, but the fog was too powerful. It dragged them down into the earth, into the cold, wet depths of the town that no longer existed. The last thing Carter heard before the darkness consumed him was Clara's voice, calling to him, echoing through the fog. "Ray! Ray, it's too late. Come find me." The world around Carter and Sarah spun, disorienting and unsteady, as the fog swallowed them whole. It felt as though the ground had disappeared entirely, replaced by an endless, suffocating void. The whispers were louder now, a deafening chorus of voices that seemed to press in from all sides. Some were familiar, some were strange, but they all carried a shared weight of despair. "Ray! Sarah! Come find me!" Clara's voice repeated, faint yet clear in the storm of whispers, pulling at Carter's very soul. He tried to block it out, tried to focus, but the sound of her voice was like a thread pulling him closer to something dark, something terrible. It was a lure, a trap, and yet he couldn't resist. His head was spinning. He reached for Sarah, but his hand grasped only thin air. His breath came in ragged gasps, panic rising in his chest. He could feel the pressure of the fog closing in around him, its cold fingers brushing against his skin, crawling deeper into his lungs, suffocating him with each passing second. It wasn't just the fog, it was alive. It was as if the very essence of the mist was consuming him, changing him. "Sarah!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the swirling madness. He couldn't see her, couldn't hear her. Only the whispers remained, pressing in on him from all sides. Then, a figure appeared out of the fog. It was hard to make out at first, a shadow moving through the swirling mist, but as it drew closer, Carter recognized it. It was Clara. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She was dressed in the same clothes she had been wearing the day she vanished, but now they were tattered and stained. Her once bright smile was gone, replaced by an expression of sadness, of pleading. "Ray," she whispered, her voice like a breath of wind, faint and distant. "You came, you found me." Carter's heart skipped a beat. He stepped forward, his mind fighting to make sense of what was happening. Was this really Clara? Was she here, in front of him? "Clara?" he asked, his voice hoarse, cracking with emotion. He reached out, his fingers trembling. "Clara, where have you been? What happened?" Clara's head tilted, and she smiled, but it was wrong. It wasn't the warm, familiar smile he remembered. This one was empty, hollow. "I'm sorry, Ray. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I can't go back. None of us can. We are the fog now. We are the whispers." Carter recoiled, his stomach churning. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. This wasn't Clara. This was something else, something twisted, something that had consumed her, just as it had consumed the others. The figure of Clara began to distort, her body shifting and warping, as though she were no longer solid, no longer real. The fog seemed to absorb her, to swallow her up, leaving nothing behind but a lingering whisper. "Ray, we're all lost." Carter staggered back, his mind racing. He turned, desperately searching for Sarah, but the fog had already taken her. He couldn't see her, couldn't hear her. The whispers drowned out everything else, and in that moment, Carter realized something far more terrifying. The fog wasn't just a force, it was a presence. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before the town had been built, long before the first whispers had started to echo through the air. It was a force that had consumed everything it touched, drawing people in with promises of escape, of solace, and then trapping them forever in its eternal chorus. The voices continued to swirl around him, some familiar, others not. He heard the voice of Hank, the gruff old fisherman who had disappeared weeks before. He heard the voice of his own mother, calling to him as if she were just a breath away. They were all here now, a cacophony of voices, all lost to the fog, all trapped in its endless grip. "Ray! Ray!" they called, their voices overlapping in a terrible chorus. "Come find us, Ray. It's not too late. We're still here. Come back to us." Carter's mind teetered on the edge of sanity. The fog was pressing in on him, suffocating him, and with every breath he took, he could feel himself becoming more and more entwined in it. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they were in his ears, in his thoughts, in his very soul. The fog was not just a mist. It was a hunger, a living, breathing thing that fed on the lost, on the desperate. And now it was feeding on Carter. He could feel it creeping through his veins, poisoning his mind, slowly turning him into one of them. One of the lost, one of the voices that would echo through the fog for eternity. "Sarah!" he cried out again, his voice breaking. He couldn't hear her anymore, couldn't sense her presence. It was as though she had vanished into the fog completely, leaving him alone to face whatever came next. He felt something cold wrap around his ankle, a slick, damp sensation that crawled up his leg. Panic surged through him, and he tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. Something was tugging at him, pulling him deeper into the fog. "No!" Carter screamed, thrashing against the invisible force. "I won't become one of you." But as the whispers became a deafening roar, he realized that resistance was futile. The fog had already claimed him, just as it had claimed the others. He would never let go. He would never escape. The ground beneath his feet gave way, and he fell, tumbling into the darkness, the fog enveloping him completely. He could no longer feel the ground, no longer hear his own thoughts. All that remained was the chorus of voices, the endless whispers calling to him, claiming him. And as the darkness closed in, he could hear his own voice joining the others, lost forever in the fog. Name of the next story, The Glass Room. He woke up to a sharp, cold sensation against his skin, as though he had been plunged into ice water. His body tensed instinctively, but when his eyes opened, he saw nothing but emptiness. The room around him was utterly still, quiet to the point that it felt unnatural. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, matching the rhythm of the rising panic in his chest. He wasn't in a bed, nor on any soft surface. The ground beneath him was smooth, cool, and sterile like glass. He pushed himself up, groaning as his hands met the floor, but instead of a texture or pattern, all he touched was a hard, flawless surface that stretched endlessly around him. The space felt infinite, and yet there was no escape. It was only then that he realized he could see himself. Everywhere. Every inch of his body reflected back at him, not as a faint shadow, but with perfect clarity. He turned his head sharply to one side. The reflection mimicked him in exact detail. There was nothing in the room but himself, his face, his clothes, his every movement duplicated with eerie precision. But it wasn't just his body that he saw. There was something strange, something off in his reflection. His eyes, for one, didn't seem right. They looked darker, deeper, as if they were staring back at him with some hidden knowledge. "What is this place?" he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. The words felt hollow in the vast emptiness. No answer came. The air was heavy, thick with silence. He looked around again, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The glass walls, if that's what they were, seemed to stretch upward and outward into an infinite distance. There was no ceiling, no floor. There was no door, no window. Just him and the reflections. With each step he took, his footsteps echoed, though the sound felt muffled, as if swallowed by the vastness of the space. His breath became quicker, shallow. A sensation of unease gripped him tightly, making him feel like he was being watched. But he wasn't alone. There were dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of reflections of himself, each one slightly different, each one a subtle variation of the original. He stepped forward, then paused. One of his reflections did not move as he did. It remained completely still, watching him with those dark, hollow eyes. A wave of unease washed over him, and his heart skipped a beat. "Hello!" His voice cracked. "Is anyone there?" Silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The reflection stood motionless, still, while the others mirrored his every move. Then, as if it had been waiting for him to speak, the still reflection began to move. Slow at first, it tilted its head, then took a single step forward. His heart pounded in his chest as the other reflection did exactly the same, but with one difference. Its movements were slower, more deliberate, more methodical. The silence seemed to stretch for eternity, but then his reflection spoke. Its voice was not his own. "Why are you here?" the reflection whispered. Its lips barely moved, but the words came through clearly, as though the air itself carried them. They reverberated in his mind more than his ears. He staggered back. What do you mean?" The reflection didn't respond immediately. Instead, it smiled. It was a grin that did not reach its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pull him in, like deep pits of darkness. It was the smile of someone who knew something he didn't. Something terrible. "You know why you're here," it murmured. "You're afraid. Afraid of everything." His pulse quickened. "I don't understand." The reflection tilted its head again, that same unsettling smile never leaving its face. "You're afraid of being alone. You're afraid of losing control. You're afraid of what you might become." It stepped forward again, this time with its hand stretched out, like it was beckoning him to come closer. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. He could feel his breath growing shallow, panicked. The reflection's eyes bored into him, and with each passing second, the glass walls seemed to close in tighter, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. I'm not afraid of you," he stammered, trying to steady his voice. "You're just a reflection. You're not real." The reflection laughed softly, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down his spine. "Not real? Oh, but I am. And you know it." It grinned wider. "We are the same, you and I. And deep down, you know you can never escape." His skin crawled. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, could feel the heaviness in the air that seemed to press against him from all sides. He spun around, his eyes darting wildly, searching for any hint of an exit, but there was nothing. Only reflections. Only him. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw something move. Another reflection, this one standing far away. At first, it seemed like nothing, just another version of him. But as he focused, he realized it was different. The other reflection wasn't simply mimicking his movements. It was doing something he couldn't see, something hidden in the shadows of the vast room. The other reflection wasn't alone. It was with someone, no, something else. Something that wasn't him. His breath caught in his throat as he looked closer, his heart racing. The other reflection seemed to be holding something, or someone. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, like smoke swirling through the air. A face that couldn't quite be made out. It was like a nightmare, a twisted, intangible thing that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But the worst part was that he recognized it. He recognized that face. It was his own. His mind raced. His pulse hammered in his chest. The figure, the shadowy form, looked like him, but distorted. As if it was something he could never truly understand. Something that had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. He wanted to scream, but his voice felt frozen, trapped within his throat. The reflection with the figure reached out a hand, just as his own reflection had done. Only this time, the hand was not empty. It was clutching something, a shard of glass, jagged and sharp, and in that moment, the reflection seemed to be offering it to the shadowy version of himself. The hand trembled, the motion slow, as if something dark was pulling at him from within. "Come closer." The voice of the reflection echoed, but now it sounded more distant, more hollow. "It's only a matter of time before you realize the truth." The glass shard gleamed faintly in the dim reflection, casting light that bent and twisted unnaturally, as if the very fabric of the space around them was warping. His body felt cold. He stepped back again, his eyes wide with terror, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. And then, from behind him, the whispers began. Low at first, like a faint murmur carried on a breeze, but gradually they grew louder. Soft, indistinct sounds that seemed to form into words he couldn't understand, but that felt deeply unsettling. The voices echoed from all directions, overlapping, calling his name. "You're not alone." The reflection spoke again, its smile never fading, its voice cold and detached. "You never were." He clenched his fists, his heart racing even faster now, pounding against his ribs. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of voices that no longer made any sense. Some sounded like his own, but twisted, distorted. Others were unfamiliar, distant and foreign. Yet they all seemed to speak to him, to call to him, urging him to listen, to understand, to embrace the truth they offered. "Come to us." The voice of the reflection became more insistent, more urgent. "Don't you want to know the truth? Don't you want to see what's hidden in the depths of your own soul?" He stumbled backward, his body moving on its own, driven by sheer panic. The glass walls around him seemed to press in closer, closing in on him, narrowing until it felt like the room was shrinking. The reflections moved with him, but there was no escape. Everywhere he turned, the reflections mirrored his every move. But some were wrong. One reflected him, but with its eyes shut, the dark circles under its lids seemingly deep enough to swallow him whole. Another smiled, too widely, a grin so grotesque it seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. And the most disturbing one of all, the one that now stood before him, staring at him with eyes so dark they swallowed the light. He could no longer tell which one was real. "You're running out of time." The reflection's voice came again, louder this time, sharper. "You can't hide from yourself forever." He felt the air grow heavier, the space around him thickening with something dark and suffocating. His breathing grew labored, shallow. He could feel something crawling beneath his skin, something that was not his own, something that felt wrong. Without warning, the whispers turned into a scream, a horrific, bone-chilling wail that shook him to his core. He froze, unable to move, as the scream reverberated off the glass walls, bending the sound in impossible directions. And then the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't the reflection. It was the voice of someone he knew. "Help me!" It was his mother's voice. He froze. The room seemed to bend around him, his world spinning, crashing down with the weight of that single, desperate plea. His heart stopped, his stomach twisted. He searched the reflections, his eyes wild, his breath quickening. The other him, the one that wasn't quite like him, was moving again. It was pulling something from the shadows. The figure, the distorted, shadowy version of himself, stepped forward, and then he saw it. In the shadow's arms, he saw a face, his mother's face. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, but she wasn't speaking anymore. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came from her. And her face, it wasn't right. There was something twisted about it, something unnatural, as if the reflection was trying to distort her, to warp her into something unrecognizable. He took a step forward, trembling, his legs feeling like lead, but before he could reach her, the reflection stepped in front of him, its hand raised as if to stop him. "You can't save her," it hissed, its voice low and almost feral. "No," he shouted, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I won't leave her." His voice cracked, but the words were born from an overwhelming sense of urgency. He had to save her. He had to get her out of here, out of this nightmare. The reflection tilted its head again, its smile stretching impossibly wide. "You can't save anyone, least of all yourself." With a sudden, sharp motion, it stepped forward and slammed its hand against the glass. The surface rippled like water, distorting everything around him. His mother's face flickered for a moment, fading into the darkness, and then she was gone. But her voice, still lingered. "Please, don't leave me." The world around him seemed to close in even more, the glass becoming more and more oppressive, pressing against him, trapping him in an inescapable prison of his own fears. "You can't escape," the reflection whispered again, its voice not a reflection of his own, but something darker. "You've never been alone, not really. Not even now." The glass began to crack, tiny lines appearing across its surface, each one reflecting a piece of his fear. The cracks spread slowly, like the steady march of a creeping illness, crawling along the edges of the glass. His heartbeat quickened as the reflection's words lingered in the air, the voice now a twisted, mocking echo. The fractured surface shimmered, warping the space around him, the broken glass reflecting his terror back at him from all sides. "You're not alone." The voice was everywhere now, not just from the reflection, but from within the walls themselves. It whispered from the cracks, it slithered beneath the glass, it was in the very air he breathed. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the realization hit him. This was not just a room. It was a prison, a reflection of everything he feared, everything he had ever run from. The walls groaned, a low, resonating sound that vibrated through the air, making his skin prickle. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, more numerous, all merging into a cacophony that rang in his ears. His mother's voice was among them, her cry of desperation mingling with the other voices, all lost in a chorus of sorrow and anguish. "Please help me." He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat as he looked around in panic. There was nowhere to hide, no way to block out the noise. Every direction he turned, there they were, reflections of himself, of the people he loved, twisted and warped, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. He could see them, all of them, moving in the glass, walking behind him, circling him, whispering his name, calling out for help. And in the center of it all stood the figure, the shadow of himself. It had grown larger, darker, more solid. Its eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, gleaming with a malice that sent ice through his veins. It stepped closer, its footfalls silent against the glass floor, its smile stretching wider. "You're part of this now." The reflection's voice was cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You can't escape it. You never could." His stomach twisted into knots. The figure reached out with long, thin fingers, touching the glass as if it could reach through. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought it might actually touch him. He recoiled, the air in the room growing heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He needed to get out. There had to be a way out. He turned, looking around desperately. There was no door, no window, no way to escape the prison of glass that held him captive. But he couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear. He had to do something. He had to. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room. It came from the floor. He gasped, stumbling backward as the floor beneath his feet split open, a jagged line forming along the glass surface. The crack spread quickly, crawling across the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The room seemed to be coming apart, disintegrating in front of him. And yet, the figure in the reflection stood unwavering, its dark eyes locked onto his, as if watching him, waiting. It's time to face the truth. The voice from the reflection was soft, almost a whisper now, but it rang in his mind like a loud bell. You can't hide anymore. Not from me. Not from them. The air was thick, suffocating. He could feel it closing in, pressing against him from all sides. His heart raced, panic flooding his chest as he struggled to breathe. The cracks in the glass widened, pieces of the floor shattering away, revealing nothing but blackness below. The whispers grew louder, the voices growing more distorted and garbled, a blend of familiar and unfamiliar sounds, as if the room itself was alive with them. He reached down, gripping the edge of a broken piece of glass that had fallen from the floor. It felt cold, sharp against his skin. The shards of glass from the cracked floor were like jagged teeth, each one gleaming with an eerie, unnatural light. His hands trembled as he gripped the shard, the sharp edge cutting into his palm. You think you can fight it? The reflection laughed, its voice echoing from all directions. You're already part of this. He swung the shard at the nearest reflection, aiming for the distorted version of himself. But as the glass hit the surface, it simply shattered, fragments scattering around him, vanishing into thin air. The broken pieces seemed to disappear into the walls, swallowed by the very glass that imprisoned him. The reflection stepped closer, its cold smile still there, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He felt the pull again, the pressure on his chest, as if the room itself were trying to drag him into the depths of the glass, into the blackness beyond. His breath caught in his throat as he felt himself being drawn forward, a magnetic force tugging at him, urging him to move closer. He resisted, pushing against the air, but it was no use. The walls seemed to stretch and shrink with every breath he took, the space around him warping, bending with unnatural speed. The reflection moved with him, its smile widening as it closed the distance between them. Come closer. The reflection whispered again, its voice low and coaxing. See what lies beneath the surface. You can't run from yourself forever. He could feel the room closing in. His lungs burned for air, his heart hammered in his chest. His eyes darted to the shards of glass scattered on the floor, each one a reflection of his own brokenness, each one a piece of the shattered truth he had been trying to escape. He couldn't let it take him. He couldn't let it win. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, driving the shard into the wall of glass. The impact reverberated through the room, a loud, sickening crack that made his bones rattle. The glass around him trembled, shuddering with the force of the strike. But still it held firm. It's no use. The reflection's voice was colder now, more distant. You can't escape. You're part of this now, and you always will be. But even as the reflection spoke, the cracks in the glass grew larger, spreading out from where he had struck it. The room began to tremble, the floor shaking beneath his feet, the walls bending inward with a violent force. And then, with a deafening roar, the glass shattered. The room exploded in a storm of glass, sharp shards scattering in every direction, slicing through the air like blades. The air was thick with the sound of shattering, the deafening crash of broken glass echoing in his ears. His hands shot up to shield his face as the glass rained down on him, but it didn't hurt. It was as if the glass was part of him now, slipping past his skin, but never truly wounding him. For a moment, everything was still. The jagged edges of the shattered glass hung suspended in the air, shimmering like 1,000 tiny mirrors, reflecting fragments of the world that no longer existed. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart still pounding in his chest. The air felt different now, lighter, almost electric. The pressure had lifted, but the fear, it remained. And then, a figure appeared through the broken walls of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the swirling darkness. But as it stepped closer, the figure took shape. A person, or something that resembled one, standing on the other side of the broken room. The figure was tall, its face obscured in shadow, and its form seemed to shift, warping in and out of focus as if it couldn't quite decide what it was. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step echoing through the room like a drumbeat. He froze, his chest tightening. The whispers had stopped, but the silence now felt more oppressive than ever. The figure, whatever it was, stepped closer, and his body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The shattered glass at his feet seemed to extend endlessly, stretching into a void that had no end. You think you've escaped. The voice that came from the figure was deep, distorted, and yet somehow familiar, like a part of his own mind speaking back to him. You're wrong. He took a step back, his feet crunching on the broken glass, the sound sharp and unnatural. But no matter how far he stepped, the figure moved with him, keeping pace with his every movement. It didn't hurry, it didn't need to. It was patient. It was waiting. You are inside now, it said, its voice echoing in the shattered air. Everything you fear, everything you've avoided, it's here with you. It's always been here. You just didn't see it. The walls, or what was left of them, seemed to pulse, their fractured edges glowing faintly, as if alive. The reflection of his own face appeared in the pieces of glass still suspended in the air, distorted and warped, 1,000 versions of himself staring back, each one trapped in a different expression: fear, anger, confusion, desperation. You were never alone, the figure continued, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. You were never separate from it. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke through the air, a loud crack that made his stomach churn. The ground beneath him shifted, the floor tilting violently to one side. He stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden movement, his heart racing as the room seemed to buckle and twist around him. The shards of glass that had once been walls now seemed to float aimlessly in space, the jagged edges reflecting the distorted room, the endless reflections staring back at him from every angle. The figure, still moving with unnatural calmness, stepped toward him. Each movement seemed to draw the very fabric of the room closer, pulling him toward it, toward the darkness in the center of the room. You can't run from yourself, the figure whispered, its voice softer now, almost tender. You can't escape the truth of what you are. His mind raced, panic rising within him like a tidal wave. He had to do something. Anything. But what? The figure was right. He had always been running. From his fears, from his mistakes, from the things he had buried deep inside himself. He had tried to bury them, to ignore them, to pretend that everything was fine. But now, in this broken room, with the shadows closing in, he couldn't escape them. The whispers returned, rising in volume until they became a roar in his ears. They were his own thoughts, his own voice mingling with those of others, all tangled together in a cacophony of confusion. It was as if the room itself was speaking to him, taunting him, pulling at his soul. Face it. The figure's voice echoed through his mind, and suddenly, the room seemed to collapse inward, the shattered glass, the fractured walls, the distorted reflections. They all merged into one terrifying vision. He was surrounded by versions of himself, versions that had lived through every choice he had ever made, every regret, every fear. The figure in the center of it all, with its dark, shifting form, was no longer an outsider. It was part of him. He stumbled forward, the ground beneath him spinning. He had to get out. He couldn't stay in this place. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the center of the room, where the figure awaited. He couldn't stop now, not when the weight of his own guilt and fear was so close. It was him. Come closer, the figure said softly, its hand reaching toward him. Its fingers stretched out, impossibly long, impossibly thin, as if it were a shadow reaching for the light. He didn't know what to do, didn't know if he was supposed to resist or to surrender. But one thing was clear, the figure was right. He had never truly been alone. The room had always reflected his fears, his mistakes, and now it was showing him the truth he had spent his whole life avoiding. You've always known this was coming. The figure's voice was low, almost comforting now. as if it were speaking the truth he had longed to hear. All of it, every choice, every fear, every part of you, it's here now. And you have to face it. He closed his eyes, the air growing colder, the whispers louder, the room growing darker. The weight of everything, the choices, the regrets, the fear, pressed down on him. It was suffocating. And then for a brief moment, he understood. He wasn't just in a room. He was trapped inside himself. With that realization, the figure reached out, and the darkness took him.